Every morning she stood hidden beyond the trees, silent, heartbroken, watching the boy who no longer remembered her. But what happens when the prince sees the sorrow in her eyes and realizes who she truly is? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of the village like a heavy woolen blanket, wrapping itself around the thatched cottages and wooden market stalls with an almost suffocating embrace. The air carried the sharp scent of damp earth mixed with the acrid smoke rising from countless hearth fires, creating a gray veil that obscured the massive stone fortress looming in the distance. Eleanor Ashford pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, the thin wool doing little to ward off the autumn chill that seeped through the fabric and into her very bones. Her fingers, already numbed by the cold, clutched the worn edges of the garment as she walked with measured steps along the muddy path that led toward the towering walls of Winterhaven Castle. Her dress, once a deep forest green, had faded over the years to a muted gray-green, patched in several places with scraps of darker fabric that spoke of countless repairs. The hem was caked with dried mud from previous journeys, and the sleeves showed signs of wear at the elbows. Despite the poverty evident in her clothing, there was a quiet dignity in the way Eleanor carried herself, her spine straight, her chin held at an angle that suggested she had not always known such hardship. Her dark auburn hair, streaked with premature threads of silver, was braided and pinned beneath a simple linen cap, though a few rebellious curls escaped to frame a face that still retained traces of remarkable beauty, despite the lines of worry and sorrow etched around her eyes and mouth. Those eyes, a striking shade of amber that seemed to catch and hold the weak morning light, were fixed on the distant castle with an intensity that bordered on desperation. They were eyes that had witnessed both joy and devastating loss, eyes that had cried until no tears remained, yet still held within them a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. As Eleanor walked, her mind drifted back through the years, through memories both sweet and bitter, to a time when her life had been vastly different from the harsh existence she now endured. She had been born into a family of minor nobility, her father a knight who had served the crown with distinction, her mother a gentle woman of grace and refinement who had taught Eleanor the skills expected of a lady. They had lived comfortably in a modest manor house on the outskirts of the kingdom, not wealthy by noble standards, but certainly never wanting for food or shelter or the basic comforts of life. Eleanor had grown up learning to read and write, to embroider and play the lute, to manage a household and conduct herself with the poise befitting her station. She had been content, happy even, surrounded by family and the promise of a secure future. Then, when she had reached her 18th year, she had met him. Sir William Ashford had been a rising knight in the service of the king, a man of impressive stature and undeniable skill with sword and lance. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed carved from oak and arms that could wield a heavy broadsword as easily as another man might hold an eating knife. His hair had been the color of dark honey, falling in waves to his shoulders, and his eyes had been a deep blue that reminded Eleanor of the sea on a clear summer day. When he smiled at her during that first meeting at a tournament held in honor of the king's name day, Eleanor had felt her heart skip in a way she had never experienced before. Their courtship had been brief but intense, filled with stolen moments in gardens and whispered conversations during formal gatherings. William had courted her with a combination of gentle respect and passionate devotion that had swept away any reservations her parents might have harbored about the match. Within 6 months, they had been wed in a ceremony that, while not grand by noble standards, had been filled with genuine joy and the blessing of both their families. Eleanor had moved into William's quarters within the castle barracks, a set of rooms that were modest but comfortable, befitting a knight of his standing. The first years of their marriage had been blessed with happiness that seemed almost too perfect to be real. William had advanced in his career, earning the favor of the king through his valor in battle and his unwavering loyalty. Eleanor had managed their household with skill, earning respect from the other knights' wives and the castle staff alike. And then, 3 years into their marriage, she had given birth to a son. They had named him Adrian, and from the moment Eleanor had first held that tiny, perfect child in her arms, she had known a love so fierce and complete that it had transformed her very understanding of what it meant to be alive. Adrian had been a beautiful baby, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair, a combination that had made both parents swell with pride. As he grew into a toddler, his personality had begun to shine through, revealing a child who was curious about everything, quick to laugh, and affectionate in ways that melted Eleanor's heart daily. William had doted on the boy, spending every free moment teaching him to ride a pony, to hold a wooden practice sword, to understand the code of honor that governed a knight's life. Their small family had been complete, their happiness seemingly unassailable. But fate, Eleanor had learned in the cruelest way possible, was a capricious mistress who delighted in destroying what brought people joy. The plague had come to the kingdom like a dark specter, sweeping through villages and towns with terrifying speed, leaving death and devastation in its wake. The castle, despite its thick walls and relative isolation, had not been spared. The sickness had crept through the corridors like an invisible enemy, striking down lords and servants alike with merciless efficiency. Eleanor remembered with painful clarity the day William had first shown symptoms. The fever had come upon him suddenly during the night, and by morning his skin had been burning to the touch, his breathing labored and painful. She had nursed him frantically, applying cool cloths to his forehead, forcing him to drink water and herbal remedies prepared by the castle's healers, praying to every saint she could name for his recovery. For 3 days he had lingered between life and death, and Eleanor had not left his side except when forced to do so by exhaustion so complete she could barely stand. On the 4th day, William had opened his eyes, looked at her with a clarity that seemed to pierce through the fog of illness, and whispered her name. "Eleanor, my love," he had said, his voice barely audible. "Promise me you will care for our son. Promise me you will keep him safe no matter what comes." She had promised through tears that streamed down her face, clutching his hand as if her grip alone could keep him tethered to life. He had smiled then, a shadow of his usual brilliant grin, and closed his eyes for the final time. Within the hour, he was gone. The grief that had consumed Eleanor in the days following William's death had been so overwhelming that she had barely been able to function. It was only the presence of Adrian, only the knowledge that her son needed her, that had kept her from surrendering entirely to the darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. She had focused all her energy on protecting the boy, on keeping him away from anyone who might be carrying the sickness, on ensuring his safety above all else. But even her most desperate efforts had not been enough. 2 weeks after William's death, Adrian had woken with the same terrible fever, the same labored breathing that had heralded his father's doom. Eleanor had felt her world shatter into pieces so small they could never be reassembled. She had fought for her son's life with every ounce of strength she possessed, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, refusing to acknowledge the possibility that she might lose him too. The castle's head healer, a woman named Catherine who had served the royal family for decades, had come to their chambers on the 3rd day of Adrian's illness. Eleanor remembered the woman's face, lined with age and wisdom and deep compassion, as she had examined the feverish child. After what had seemed like an eternity, Catherine had pulled Eleanor aside, away from the bed where Adrian lay struggling for each breath. "My lady," Catherine had said gently, her weathered hand gripping Eleanor's arm with surprising strength. "I believe your son will survive this sickness. His fever is beginning to break, and his breathing is becoming easier. But there is something you must understand." She had paused, her gray eyes filled with both sympathy and determination. "The king has decreed that all children who survive the plague must be quarantined within the castle walls for a period of no less than 2 years, to ensure they carry no lingering traces of the sickness that might spread to others. It is a harsh measure, I know, but it comes from a place of desperate necessity. Too many have died already." Eleanor had felt her legs weaken beneath her, and only Catherine's firm grip had kept her from collapsing to the floor. "But surely," she had managed to say through the tightness in her throat, "surely as his mother, I would be allowed to stay with him, to care for him during this quarantine." The healer had shaken her head slowly, regret written clearly across her features. "I am sorry, my lady, but the decree makes no exceptions. The children will be cared for by healers and servants who have already survived the plague and are therefore no longer at risk. Parents and family members who have not contracted the sickness must remain outside the quarantine areas to protect them from possible exposure." The world had seemed to tilt on its axis in that moment. Eleanor had rushed back to Adrian's bedside, gathering the semi-conscious child into her arms, holding him with a fierceness that came from the very depths of her soul. "No," she had whispered against his sweat-dampened hair. "No, they cannot take you from me. I have lost your father. I cannot lose you too." But even as she spoke the words, she had known they were futile. The king's decree was law, and law in the medieval kingdom of England was absolute and unyielding. The following day, when Adrian's fever had indeed broken and it became clear he would survive, guards had come to remove him from Eleanor's care. She had fought them, screaming and clawing like a wild animal, her dignity and composure abandoned in the face of losing her only child. It had taken 4 men to pry Adrian from her arms, and the boy, confused and frightened by his mother's distress, had cried out for her as they carried him away. That sound, that desperate cry of "Mama," had echoed in Eleanor's mind every day since, a constant reminder of her helplessness and loss. But the cruelty of fate had not been finished with Eleanor Ashford. Within a week of Adrian being taken into quarantine, she had received notice that William's debts she had known nothing about, had come due. Her husband, it seemed, had borrowed heavily to maintain their lifestyle and to purchase better armor and weapons, always believing his next advancement would allow him to repay what he owed. His death had made those debts her responsibility, and without his income as a knight, she had no means to settle them. The creditors had been merciless. Within a month, everything she owned had been seized and sold. The modest furnishings of their quarters, her jewelry, her fine dresses, even her mother's treasured loot had been taken and auctioned to pay what was owed. When even that had not been enough to cover the full amount of the debt, Eleanor had been evicted from the castle, forced to leave with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing a few personal items of no monetary value. A ribbon Adrian had worn as a baby, a letter William had written her during their courtship, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet. With no family left to turn to, her parents having died years earlier and her brother having perished in a border skirmish, Eleanor had been forced to seek shelter in the village that clustered at the base of the castle hill. She had found work where she could, taking in washing, mending clothes for those who could afford to pay, sometimes cleaning the homes of merchants and craftsmen. The work was hard and the pay meager, barely enough to afford a tiny room in a boarding house run by a widow named Beatrice, a woman whose own hardships had made her sympathetic to Eleanor's plight. The room Eleanor called home was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small trunk. The walls were rough wood, the floor bare-packed earth, and in winter the cold seeped through every crack and crevice. There was no hearth in her room. She was allowed to use the common fire downstairs for cooking when she could afford food to cook. It was a far cry from the life she had once known, but Eleanor had learned that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She worked, she survived, and she endured. But through all of this, through the loss and the hardship and the grinding poverty, Eleanor had held fast to one unwavering purpose. She would see her son again, even if only from a distance. The quarantine had been extended beyond the initial 2 years due to recurring outbreaks of lesser illnesses, and now, 3 years after Adrian had been taken from her, he remained within the castle walls, growing up without his mother, being raised by servants and tutors appointed by the crown. Eleanor had discovered, through careful questions asked of castle servants who came to the village for supplies, that children orphaned by the plague or separated from their families were being educated and cared for in a special wing of the castle. Those of noble birth, like Adrian, were being trained as pages, the first step toward becoming squires and eventually knights. The knowledge that her son was safe, fed, and being prepared for a future befitting his father's legacy was a small comfort, but it did nothing to ease the aching emptiness in Eleanor's heart. So she had begun her daily pilgrimage to the castle. Every morning, before dawn broke fully over the horizon, Eleanor would make the long walk from the village to the castle grounds. She could not enter, of course. Her status as a debtor and her eviction from the castle premises meant she was forbidden from passing through the gates. But there was a spot, a small clearing in the woods that bordered the castle's eastern wall, from which she could see into the training yard where the pages practiced their skills. From this vantage point, hidden among the trees, Eleanor would watch for hours, her eyes scanning the groups of boys who practiced with wooden swords, who ran drills carrying heavy shields, who learned to groom and saddle horses. She had learned to recognize Adrian by his movements, by the particular shade of his auburn hair that caught the light in a way that reminded her painfully of her own, by the way he held himself with a combination of determination and grace that echoed his father's bearing. She never called out to him. She never tried to make her presence known. The risk was too great. If she were discovered, she might be banned from even this distant observation, or worse, Adrian might be punished for his mother's trespass. So she remained silent and hidden, watching her son grow from a distance, memorizing every detail of his changing face and form, treasuring these stolen glimpses as a miser treasures gold. Now, as Eleanor navigated the familiar path through the early morning mist, her thoughts were consumed by the usual mixture of anticipation and sorrow that accompanied these daily vigils. Would she see Adrian today? Would he be among the boys in the training yard? Or would he be attending lessons inside the castle where she could not observe him? The uncertainty was a constant torment, but even the possibility of catching a glimpse of her son was enough to draw her here day after day, regardless of weather or circumstance. The walk from the village to the clearing took nearly an hour at Eleanor's steady pace. Her legs had grown strong from these daily journeys, though her worn leather shoes, patched and repaired countless times, provided little protection from the stones and roots that littered the path. As she walked, she passed other villagers beginning their daily routines, farmers leading oxen toward distant fields, women carrying baskets to the market, children chasing chickens that had escaped from their coops. Some nodded to her in acknowledgement. Others pretended not to see her, their discomfort with her fallen status evident in their averted eyes. Eleanor had learned not to take offense. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval English society, her fall from minor nobility to poverty had placed her in a strange liminal space, neither fully common nor able to claim the respect her birth should have afforded her. She was a reminder to others of how quickly fortune could turn, how fragile the security of any position could be, and people tended to shy away from such uncomfortable reminders. As the castle walls came into view, growing larger and more imposing with each step, Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that combination of hope and heartache that had become as much a part of her daily routine as breathing. The fortress of Winterhaven was a magnificent structure, built of gray stone that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Massive cylindrical towers marked each corner, connected by thick walls that bristled with battlements and arrow slits. The eastern tower, the tallest of the four, flew the king's banner, a crimson field emblazoned with a golden lion that snapped and rippled in the morning breeze. Eleanor veered off the main road, taking a smaller, overgrown path that led into the forest bordering the castle grounds. The trees here were ancient oaks and elms, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the weak autumn sunlight into shifting patterns of light and shadow. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and brambles, and Eleanor had to move carefully to avoid catching her dress on thorns or tripping over hidden roots. But she knew this path as well as she knew the lines on her own palm, having traveled it countless times in all seasons and all weather. After several minutes of careful navigation through the woods, Eleanor reached her destination, a small natural clearing where a massive fallen log, covered in moss and lichen, provided a seat with a perfect view through the trees to the castle's training yard. From here, partially concealed by the trunk of a particularly large oak, Eleanor could observe without being observed, at least by anyone who was not specifically looking for a watcher in the woods. She settled onto the log, arranging her skirts around her legs for whatever warmth the thin fabric could provide, and turned her attention to the training yard below. The space was large, perhaps 50 paces across, with packed dirt ground that had been worn smooth by countless feet and hooves. Around the perimeter stood wooden practice dummies, their surfaces scarred and splintered from years of sword strikes. A weapons rack held an array of wooden practice swords, shields of various sizes, and training lances. At the far end of the yard, a stable housed the horses used for riding instruction. Eleanor's amber eyes scanned the training yard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this same surveillance hundreds of times before. The morning sun had climbed higher now, burning away the last vestiges of mist and illuminating the castle grounds with pale golden light. She could see figures beginning to emerge from the castle's eastern entrance, a stream of boys ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 14 years, all dressed in similar tunics of undyed wool over leather breeches, their feet clad in sturdy boots suitable for the rigorous training ahead. Her heart quickened, as it always did during these first moments of observation, her eyes darting from one young face to another, searching desperately for the one that belonged to her son. The boys assembled in neat lines under the direction of a tall, severe-looking man, Eleanor had come to recognize as Master Edmund, the weapons master responsible for training the pages. He was a formidable figure, his muscular frame still impressive despite the silver threading through his dark hair and beard, his voice capable of carrying across the entire yard when he bellowed instructions or corrections. And then she saw him. Adrian stood in the second row, fourth from the left, and even from this distance Eleanor could see how much he had grown in the 3 years since she had last held him in her arms. He was 9 years old now, though he would turn 10 within a few months, and already he showed signs of the man he would become. He had inherited his father's height, standing several inches taller than most of the other boys his age, and his shoulders had begun to broaden in a way that promised the same impressive build William had possessed. His auburn hair, so like Eleanor's own, fell in waves to his shoulders, catching the sunlight in shades of copper and bronze. But it was his face that always captured Eleanor's attention most completely, for in his features she could see both herself and William merged into something entirely unique and precious. He had his father's strong jaw and straight nose, but his eyes, even from this distance, held the same amber hue as Eleanor's, and his mouth curved in a way that reminded her of her own smile. He stood with perfect posture, his attention focused entirely on Master Edmund, and Eleanor felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost painful. Whatever hardships fate had inflicted upon her, she had given the world this remarkable child, and no amount of suffering could diminish that achievement. Master Edmund began barking instructions, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp morning air. "Today we continue your training in mounted combat. You will each take turns approaching the quintain at full gallop and striking the target with your lance. Remember what I have taught you. Keep your eyes on the target, not on the lance. Your horse knows its job. Trust the beast and focus on your strike. The quintain will spin when struck properly, and you must duck quickly to avoid the counterweight. Those who fail to do so will find themselves unseated and bruised, which will serve as an excellent lesson in maintaining awareness of your surroundings." The boys dispersed to their assigned tasks, some heading toward the stables to prepare the horses, others moving to collect practice lances from the weapons rack. Eleanor watched as Adrian joined a group heading to the stables, his movements confident and purposeful. Even in this simple task, she could see evidence of the training he had received, the way he carried himself with a blend of discipline and natural athleticism that would have made William burst with fatherly pride. As Eleanor continued her observation, she found herself lost in thoughts of what Adrian's life must be like within those castle walls. Did he remember her? He had been only 6 when they were separated, old enough surely to retain some memories of his mother, of the life they had shared before the plague stole everything from them. Did he wonder where she was? Why she had not come for him? Did he feel abandoned? Or had the tutors and servants who now shaped his days convinced him that his mother had perished along with his father? These questions tortured Eleanor during the long hours of her days and the longer, lonelier hours of her nights. She had considered countless times trying to send him a message, some token that would let him know she was alive and thinking of him always. But the risks of such an action were too great. If discovered, she might bring shame upon Adrian, might damage his prospects within the rigid social structure of the castle. The son of a knight who had died with honor was one thing. The son of a woman who had fallen into poverty and debt was quite another. Better, she had convinced herself, to let him believe her dead and beyond the reach of hardship than to burden him with the knowledge of her degraded circumstances. A commotion in the training yard pulled Eleanor from her melancholic reflections. The boys were returning from the stables now, leading horses that had been saddled and bridled for the mounted combat exercises. Adrian walked beside a magnificent gray gelding, his hand resting lightly on the animal's neck in a gesture that suggested familiarity and mutual trust. The horse was nearly 16 hands high, powerfully built, with a flowing mane and tail that rippled like silk in the morning breeze. It was clearly a valuable animal, the sort of mount reserved for the most promising students. Master Edmund positioned himself at the center of the yard while his assistants set up the quinton, a T-shaped wooden structure that rotated on a central pole. On one end of the crossbar hung a shield painted with concentric circles to serve as a target. On the other end hung a heavy sandbag as a counterweight. When struck properly, the entire apparatus would spin, and the rider had to duck quickly or risk being knocked from his saddle by the swinging counterweight. "Adrian Ashford!" Master Edmund's voice rang out across the yard, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat at the sound of her son's name. You shall demonstrate first. Show these younger boys how a true knight in training approaches the quintain." Eleanor's hands gripped the mossy bark of the fallen log beneath her as she leaned forward, her entire being focused on the scene unfolding below. Adrian acknowledged the order with a respectful nod, then mounted his horse with a fluid grace that spoke of countless hours of practice. He settled into the saddle, adjusted his seat, and accepted a practice lance from one of Master Edmund's assistants. The wooden lance was perhaps 8 feet long, painted in alternating bands of red and white, its tip blunted to prevent serious injury during training exercises. Adrian walked his horse to the far end of the yard, turned to face the quintain, and sat motionless for several heartbeats. Eleanor could see him composing himself, settling his breathing, preparing his mind and body for the task ahead. Even from her distant vantage point, she could sense his concentration, the way he seemed to block out everything except the target before him and the horse beneath him. Then, with a subtle shift of his weight and a gentle pressure of his heels against the gelding's flanks, Adrian urged his mount into motion. The horse responded immediately, moving from a standstill to a canter in smooth, powerful strides. Adrian's posture in the saddle was textbook perfect, his back straight but not rigid, his hips moving in rhythm with the horse's gait, the lance held steady at his side with its tip angled slightly upward. As horse and rider approached the quintain, Adrian's focus became even more intense. Eleanor watched as he lowered the lance into striking position, his arm extending, his eyes locked on the center of the painted shield target. The thunder of hoofbeats echoed off the castle walls, growing louder with each stride, and then, in a moment that seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously, the tip of Adrian's lance struck the shield dead center with a resounding crack that reverberated across the training yard. The quintain spun with violent speed, the counterweight sandbag whipping around in a deadly arc that would have unseated a less prepared rider. But Adrian, anticipating the movement with the instincts of someone who had performed this exercise countless times, ducked low over his horse's neck, the sandbag passing harmlessly over his head with inches to spare. He straightened in the saddle, brought his horse around in a controlled circle, and returned to his starting position, his face showing no expression beyond calm professionalism. The other boys erupted in spontaneous applause, and even Master Edmund allowed himself a small smile of approval. "Well done, Ashford," the weapons master called out. "That is precisely the form and timing I expect from all of you." Note how young Adrian kept his eyes on the target throughout the approach, how he maintained his seat despite the violent spinning of the quintain, how he controlled his horse with subtle cues rather than harsh yanking on the reins. This is the standard you must all strive to achieve. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks, though she made no sound and barely noticed her own crying. The pride that swelled in her chest was so overwhelming, it felt as though her ribs might crack from the pressure of it. That was her son down there, her Adrian, performing with skill and courage that would have made his father weep with joy. Despite everything that had been taken from him, despite growing up without his parents, he was thriving, becoming exactly the sort of young man William had dreamed he would be. As the training session continued, with each boy taking his turn at the quintain with varying degrees of success, Eleanor remained transfixed, her attention never wavering from Adrian. She watched as he waited patiently for his next turn, as he offered quiet encouragement to a younger boy who had been unseated by the counterweight, as he tended to his horse with obvious care and affection. Every gesture, every expression, every moment was precious to her, to be memorized and treasured and recalled during the long, empty hours when she could not see him. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, burning away the last of the autumn chill and bringing genuine warmth to the training yard. Master Edmund put the boys through a series of increasingly difficult exercises, having them approach the quintain from different angles, at different speeds, while performing various maneuvers. Through it all, Adrian distinguished himself repeatedly, his natural talent enhanced by obvious dedication and practice. But it was during a brief rest period, when the boys were allowed to water their horses and take a few moments to catch their breath, that something unexpected happened. Something that would change the course of Eleanor's life and Adrian's in ways neither could have anticipated. Adrian had dismounted and was leading his gray gelding toward the water troughs when he suddenly stopped, his head turning sharply toward the tree line where Eleanor sat hidden. For one heart-stopping moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Eleanor felt the world narrow to just the two of them, mother and son, separated by circumstance and cruel fortune, but connected by bonds that transcended physical proximity. She saw Adrian's expression change, saw confusion flicker across his features, followed by something that looked almost like recognition, though surely that was impossible. He had been so young when they were separated. How could he possibly recognize her now, from such a distance, partially obscured by trees and shadows? Eleanor's first instinct was to shrink back, to hide more completely among the trees, but she found herself frozen in place, unable to break the connection of that shared gaze. Adrian took a step toward the tree line, then another, his horse forgotten behind him, his entire attention focused on the woods where his mother watched with a mixture of hope and terror. He raised one hand, perhaps in greeting, perhaps simply to shade his eyes for a better view, and opened his mouth as if to call out. But before any sound could emerge, a new voice cut through the moment, like a blade through silk. "Adrian Ashford, attend me at once." The command came from a figure Eleanor had not noticed approaching the training yard, a young man who moved with the unconscious authority of someone born to command. He was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, tall and powerfully built, with hair the color of dark wheat that fell in carefully arranged waves to his shoulders. He wore clothing that immediately marked him as nobility of the highest order, a tunic of deep blue wool, richly embroidered with silver thread in patterns that caught and reflected the sunlight, over black leather breeches, a heavy cloak of midnight blue, trimmed with ermine fur despite the relative warmth of the day, hung from his broad shoulders, held in place by an ornate silver clasp worked in the shape of a lion. Eleanor recognized him immediately, though she had never been formally introduced. This was Prince Edmund, the king's only son and heir to the throne, a young man whose reputation for both military prowess and scholarly achievement had spread throughout the kingdom. He had his father's strong features and commanding presence, but there was something in his gray eyes, some quality of intelligence and perception, that suggested depths beyond what might be expected from a typical young prince focused solely on martial glory. Adrian immediately abandoned whatever impulse had drawn him toward the tree line and hurried to the prince's side, executing a bow that was both respectful and graceful. "Your Highness," he said clearly, his young voice carrying across the yard, "how may I serve you?" The prince studied Adrian for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking. "I have been observing your training from the tower window," he said, his voice pitched to carry without seeming to strain. "Your performance at the Quinton was exceptional. Master Edmund speaks highly of your progress in all aspects of your education." He paused, then added with what might have been the ghost of a smile, "Though I noticed your attention seemed to wander toward the woods just now. Is there something among the trees more interesting than your duties here?" Eleanor felt her heart hammering so hard she feared it might be audible even at this distance. Had the prince seen her? Was Adrian about to be questioned about why he had been staring into the forest? Would this lead to discovery, to consequences she could not even bear to imagine? But Adrian, whether through genuine ignorance or careful diplomacy beyond his years, simply shook his head. "Forgive me, Your Highness. I thought I saw a deer moving among the shadows. My father used to take me hunting before." He trailed off, and Eleanor saw the flicker of old pain cross his young face. "Before he died. I suppose the memory distracted me for a moment." The prince's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I understand," he said quietly. "I knew your father, you know. Sir William Ashford served on several campaigns with my own father. He was a man of great courage and loyalty. You do his memory honor by excelling in your training." He placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder in a gesture that seemed both kind and oddly protective. "Walk with me. I wish to discuss your future prospects." As the prince led Adrian away from the training yard toward the castle's gardens, Eleanor remained frozen on her log, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. The prince had known William. The prince had been watching Adrian's training. The prince had shown interest in her son's future. What did it all mean? Was this good fortune or the beginning of some new complication that would make her impossible situation even more difficult? She watched until Adrian and the prince disappeared from view around the corner of the castle's eastern wing, then sat in silence for several more minutes, trying to process everything that had happened. The other boys had returned to their training, but Eleanor found she could no longer focus on their activities. Her mind was too consumed with questions, with possibilities both hopeful and terrifying, with the memory of that moment when Adrian's eyes had seemed to find hers across the distance. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith and her stomach reminded her that she had not eaten since the previous evening's meager supper of bread and thin broth, Eleanor rose from her log and began the journey back to the village. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, whether from sitting still for so long or from the emotional turbulence of the morning, she could not say. She made her way carefully through the forest, retracing the path she had traveled so many times before, her mind a whirl of thoughts and feelings she could barely articulate even to herself. The walk back seemed both longer and shorter than usual, time behaving in that strange elastic way it does when one's mind is preoccupied with matters of great importance. Eleanor noticed little of her surroundings, her feet following the familiar route by memory rather than conscious attention. She passed other villagers going about their daily business, but their greetings and conversations seemed to come from very far away, muted and indistinct like voices heard through thick stone walls. When she finally reached the village proper, with its crooked streets and tightly packed buildings, Eleanor headed straight for the boarding house where she rented her tiny room. The building was a sagging 3-story structure that had once been a prosperous inn, but had fallen on hard times and been converted to provide cheap lodging for those with nowhere else to go. The wooden beams were warped with age, the plaster walls cracked and stained, and the thatched roof showed patches of newer material where repairs had been made to prevent leaks. Eleanor entered through the side door that led to the residence rooms, climbing the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor where her chamber was located. The stairs creaked alarmingly under her weight, and she had to feel her way in the dimness, as there were no windows in the stairwell and the landlady was too miserly to provide candles for common areas. When she reached her door, she fumbled with the simple wooden latch and stepped inside, closing the door behind her and leaning against it with a sigh of exhaustion that came from her very soul. The room was exactly as she had left it that morning. The narrow bed with its thin straw mattress and single threadbare blanket, the small trunk containing her few possessions, a wooden stool that served as her only furniture besides the bed, and a cracked pottery jug for water. There was one small window, its shutters open to admit what light and air they could, though the view was nothing more inspiring than the wall of the building next door, close enough that Eleanor could have reached out and touched it if she extended her arm. She moved to the bed and sat down heavily, her mind still processing the morning's events. The image of Adrian's face kept appearing in her thoughts, the way he had looked when their eyes met, that expression that had seemed so much like recognition, and then the prince's arrival, his obvious interest in her son, the kindness in his voice when he spoke of William. What did it all portend? Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow bed for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing all meaning as her thoughts churned endlessly through the same questions and possibilities. The weak afternoon light filtering through her small window gradually shifted, painting moving shadows across the rough wooden floor, but she barely noticed. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, had gone numb from the pressure of her grip, yet she could not seem to relax them. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Adrian's face turning toward the tree line, saw the prince's hand settling on her son's shoulder with that gesture of favor and protection. A sharp knock on her door startled Eleanor from her reverie. She rose quickly, smoothing her worn dress with trembling hands, and opened the door to find Beatrice, the boarding house's owner, standing in the dim hallway. The older woman was perhaps 60 years of age, her face deeply lined by hardship and loss. Her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her cheekbones. But her eyes, pale blue and surprisingly keen, held a measure of warmth that her stern expression did not convey. "Eleanor," Beatrice said without preamble, her voice rough from years of breathing smoke from cooking fires, "there's a woman downstairs asking for you. Says she has work that needs doing, mending for a household. I told her you were skilled with a needle, that you'd do honest work for fair pay." She paused, studying Eleanor's face with those perceptive eyes. "You look troubled, girl. Are you well enough to take on more work?" Eleanor managed a wan smile, grateful for the older woman's concern, even as she felt the weight of her secrets pressing down on her like a physical burden. "I am well enough, Beatrice. Thank you for sending the work my way. I will come down directly." Beatrice nodded but did not immediately leave, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said slowly, "I've watched you these past 3 years, Eleanor Ashford. Watched you walk to that castle every morning before dawn. Watched you return each afternoon looking like your heart has been torn fresh from your chest. I don't claim to know your business, and I won't pry where I'm not wanted. but I want you to understand something." She stepped closer, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the hallway to overhear. "Whatever burden you carry, whatever grief drives you to that castle day after day, you don't have to bear it alone. I lost my own children to the plague, lost my husband to a fever 2 winters past. I know what it means to have your world shattered and to have to keep living anyway, to keep putting one foot in front of the other even when every step feels impossible." Her weathered hand reached out and grasped Eleanor's with surprising strength. "If ever you need someone to talk to, someone to share your load, my door is open to you. Remember that." Eleanor felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, moved by this unexpected offer of kindness from a woman who had her own mountains of sorrow to climb. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your words mean more to me than you can know." Beatrice squeezed her hand once more, then released it and turned to descend the stairs, her footsteps heavy but steady on the creaking wooden steps. Eleanor took a moment to compose herself, wiping at her eyes and taking several deep breaths to steady her racing heart. Then she followed Beatrice down to the common room on the first floor, where a well-dressed woman of perhaps 40 years waited near the cold hearth. The woman wore a dress of fine brown wool, embroidered at the collar and cuffs with thread that had once been golden but had faded to a dull yellow-brown with age and wear. Her hair, streaked with gray, was covered by a linen cap trimmed with lace, and her hands, though work-worn, bore none of the calluses and scars that marked Eleanor's own palms. "Mistress Eleanor?" the woman inquired, her accent marking her as someone who had been educated beyond the common villagers, perhaps a merchant's wife or the widow of a minor official. "I am Mistress Helen, wife to Geoffrey the cloth merchant. I understand you are skilled at mending and alterations." Eleanor curtsied respectfully, falling back on the manners she had been taught in her youth, when such gestures had been second nature. "I am indeed, Mistress Helen. I would be pleased to take on whatever work you require." Mistress Helen's face relaxed into a smile of relief. "Excellent. I have several garments that need attention. My husband's best tunic has developed a tear in the sleeve that requires invisible mending. My daughter's dress needs the hem let down as she has grown considerably this past year, and I have a cloak that needs the lining replaced entirely. Would you be able to complete such work within a week's time?" Eleanor considered quickly. The work described was substantial but certainly within her capabilities. "Yes, mistress, I could have everything ready for you within the week. My rate is 3 pennies per garment for such detailed work." It was a modest price, barely enough to cover her most basic needs even if she worked from dawn until her candle guttered out each night. But Eleanor had learned that asking for more often resulted in losing the work entirely to some other desperate woman willing to labor for even less. 3 pennies per garment is acceptable," Mistress Helen agreed, to Eleanor's quiet relief. "I will send my serving girl with the items tomorrow morning. When you have completed the work, you may return them to our shop in the market square. The one with the blue shutters, you cannot miss it." She reached into the leather purse hanging from her belt and withdrew 9 pennies, placing them in Eleanor's outstretched palm. "I pay half now, as is proper, and the remainder upon satisfactory completion." Eleanor closed her fingers around the coins, feeling their solid weight, their promise of a few more days of survival. "Thank you, Mistress Helen. I will give your garments the utmost care and attention." The merchant's wife nodded her satisfaction and departed, leaving Eleanor standing in the common room with the coins clutched in her hand, and Beatrice watching from beside the cold hearth. "That's good fortune," Beatrice observed. 9 pennies total is more than you usually see in a fortnight. Perhaps the tide is beginning to turn for you, girl. Eleanor wanted to believe it, wanted to see this small stroke of luck as a sign that better days might be ahead, but years of disappointment had taught her to guard against hope. Hope was a dangerous thing for someone in her position. It made the inevitable falls hurt that much more when they came. "Perhaps," she said noncommittally, then excused herself to return to her room. That evening, after a supper of bread and cheese purchased with one of her newly acquired pennies, Eleanor sat on her bed with her sewing basket beside her, preparing her needles and thread for the work that would arrive in the morning. The basket was one of the few possessions she had managed to keep through all her trials, a beautifully woven willow container that her mother had given her on her wedding day. Inside were her needles of various sizes, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to prevent rust, spools of thread in different colors and weights, a small pair of scissors with handles worn smooth by years of use, and a silver thimble that had been a gift from William during their first year of marriage. As Eleanor's fingers moved through the familiar contents of her sewing basket, organizing and checking her supplies, her mind drifted once again to the morning's events. She replayed every moment in exquisite detail. The way Adrian had moved through his training exercises with such confidence and skill, the pride that had glowed in Master Edmund's face when he praised her son's performance, the unexpected appearance of Prince Edmund and his obvious interest in Adrian's progress and future. That last element troubled Eleanor more than she wanted to admit. On one hand, having the Crown Prince take notice of Adrian could open doors that would otherwise remain forever closed to the son of a dead knight and a mother fallen into poverty. The patronage of royalty could mean opportunities for advancement, for distinction, for a future far brighter than Adrian might otherwise achieve. But on the other hand, drawing the attention of those in power could be dangerous. Court politics were treacherous, full of hidden rivalries and deadly intrigues. What if the prince's interest in Adrian somehow placed her son in jeopardy? Eleanor shook her head, trying to dispel such dark thoughts. She was being foolish, allowing her imagination to conjure threats from shadows. The prince had merely complimented Adrian's training and mentioned knowing William. There was no reason to assume anything more sinister or complex than simple recognition of merit. And yet, the worry persisted. A small cold knot in the pit of her stomach that refused to dissolve no matter how she reasoned with herself. Sleep, when it finally came that night, was fitful and haunted by confused dreams. Eleanor found herself walking through the castle corridors, searching for Adrian, calling his name through endless halls that shifted and changed even as she tried to navigate them. She could hear her son's voice responding, always just around the next corner, always just beyond her reach. But no matter how fast she ran or how desperately she searched, she could never find him. She woke several times, her heart pounding, her throat tight with unshed tears, before finally sinking into a deeper, dreamless exhaustion as dawn approached. The next morning, Eleanor forced herself through her usual routine, despite having slept poorly. She rose before first light, washed her face in the cold water from her jug, and dressed in her cleanest worn dress, a faded blue garment that had once been much finer before years of constant wear had thinned the fabric and dulled its color. She braided her hair and pinned it beneath her cap, then made her way downstairs and out into the pre-dawn darkness, heading once again toward the castle and her hidden vantage point in the woods. The walk seemed longer than usual, her tired legs protesting each step, but Eleanor pushed herself forward with grim determination. Missing even a single day of watching Adrian felt impossible, as though breaking the routine might somehow sever the invisible thread that connected her to her son. The forest was dark and full of rustling sounds as nocturnal creatures finished their hunting and diurnal animals began to stir, but Eleanor moved through it without fear, her familiarity with the path making up for the lack of light. She reached her fallen log just as the eastern sky began to pale with the approaching dawn, settling into her usual position with a sigh of relief. The training yard below was still empty. The castle itself mostly dark except for a few windows where early rising servants had already lit candles or stirred up fires. Eleanor pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the morning chill and prepared herself for the long wait until the pages would emerge for their daily training. But this morning brought an unexpected development. As the sun crept higher and began to paint the castle walls with shades of pink and gold, Eleanor noticed unusual activity near the main gates. Guards were assembling in formation, perhaps 24 men in the livery of the king's household, their armor polished to a high shine that caught and reflected the early light. Horses were being led from the stables, not the training mounts used by the pages, but destrier war horses, huge, powerful beasts bred and trained for battle, each one worth more than Eleanor could earn in several lifetimes. And then Eleanor saw the reason for all this activity. Prince Edmund emerged from the castle's main entrance, and even from her distant position, Eleanor could see that he was dressed for a journey. He wore traveling clothes of rich materials, a tunic of deep green wool over a shirt of fine linen, dark brown leather breeches, and tall boots that rose nearly to his knees. Over all of this he had thrown a heavy cloak of forest green lined with fur, fastened at his throat with that same lion-shaped clasp she had noticed the previous day. At his side hung a sword in a leather scabbard decorated with silver fittings, and his belt held a dagger with a jeweled pommel that flashed in the sunlight. But what made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat was the sight of the small figure walking beside the prince. Adrian, dressed in traveling clothes similar to the prince's though made of less expensive materials, matched the older man's stride with obvious effort, his shorter legs requiring 2 steps for every one of the prince's longer strides. They were talking, their voices too low to carry to Eleanor's hiding place, but she could see animation in Adrian's gestures and what looked like genuine warmth in the prince's responses. Eleanor watched in growing confusion and concern as the prince and Adrian mounted their horses, the prince on a magnificent black stallion that danced and tossed its head with barely contained energy, Adrian on a smaller but still impressive bay gelding that stood quietly while the boy settled into the saddle. The guards formed up around them in a protective formation, and then, with a command Eleanor could not hear, the entire company began to move toward the castle gates. Panic seized Eleanor's heart. Where were they going? Why was Adrian accompanying the prince? How long would they be gone? The questions tumbled through her mind in a chaotic rush, each one more distressing than the last. She wanted to run down from her hiding place, to call out to Adrian, to demand answers from someone, anyone, who could tell her what was happening to her son. But of course she could do no such thing. She could only sit frozen on her log, her hands gripping the rough bark hard enough to drive splinters into her palms, and watch as the mounted company passed through the gates and began to make its way down the road that led away from the castle and toward the distant hills. Eleanor remained in her hiding place long after the last rider had disappeared from view, her eyes fixed on the empty road, her mind refusing to accept what she had just witnessed. Adrian was gone. Her daily vigil, the one constant in her life, the single thread of connection to her son, had been rendered meaningless. She had no idea where he had been taken or when he might return. The emptiness of that realization was so overwhelming that for several long minutes Eleanor could not even breathe properly, her chest tight with an anguish that went beyond mere words. Finally, moving like someone in a dream, Eleanor rose from the log and began to make her way back through the forest. But instead of returning directly to the village, she found herself detouring toward the castle's main gates, driven by a desperate need to learn something, anything, about where Adrian had gone, and why. She approached the guards stationed at the gate with trepidation, knowing that her appearance marked her as someone of no consequence, someone these armed men might easily dismiss, or worse. "Please," she said to the nearest guard, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes, "I saw the prince departing with a company this morning. Can you tell me where they have gone?" The guard studied her for a moment, his expression measuring, then seemed to decide she posed no threat. "The prince has gone to inspect the northern border fortifications," he said in a voice roughened by years of shouting commands. "There have been reports of increased activity from the Scottish raiders, and His Highness wishes to assess our defensive preparations personally. He has taken several of the more advanced pages with him, both to continue their education and to demonstrate to the border lords that the crown takes their security seriously." "How long will they be gone?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice and not entirely succeeding. The guard shrugged. "A week, perhaps 2. Depends on what the prince finds when he reaches the border and whether he decides to linger to oversee improvements to the fortifications." He gave Eleanor a curious look. "Why do you ask? Have you business with the prince's party?" Eleanor shook her head quickly. "No business. I merely wondered. Thank you for the information." She turned away before the guard could ask any more questions, hurrying back toward the village with her heart hammering in her chest. A week or 2. Adrian would be gone for a week or 2, traveling to the dangerous northern borders where Scottish raiders posed a constant threat. Her son, her precious boy who was all she had left in this world, was riding into potential danger, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to protect him. The walk back to the village passed in a blur. Eleanor was barely aware of her surroundings, her feet following the familiar path by instinct rather than conscious thought. When she reached the boarding house, she climbed the stairs to her room, closed the door behind her, and finally allowed herself to collapse onto her bed. The tears came then, hot and bitter, soaking into her thin pillow as her body shook with silent sobs. She wept for Adrian, for the dangers he might face on his journey. She wept for herself, for the helplessness and impotence of her position. She wept for William, for the fact that he was not here to protect their son as a father should. And she wept for the unfairness of a world that could take everything from a person and then demand they somehow continue to function. to survive, to endure. Eventually, the tears subsided, leaving Eleanor feeling hollow and exhausted but slightly calmer. She rose from the bed, splashed cold water on her face from her jug, and tried to pull herself together. Mistress Helen's serving girl would be arriving soon with the garments that needed mending, and Eleanor needed to be ready to receive them. Work, she reminded herself, was one of the few things she still had control over. She could not protect Adrian or change her circumstances, but she could thread a needle and mend a torn sleeve, and there was strange comfort in that small certainty. The days that followed Adrian's departure were among the longest and most difficult Eleanor had endured since losing her husband to the plague. Each morning she still rose before dawn, still made the long walk to her hidden vantage point in the forest, still sat on her moss-covered log watching the empty training yard below. The other pages continued their lessons and exercises under Master Edmund's stern guidance, but Eleanor's eyes could not focus on them. She found herself staring instead at the spot where she had last seen Adrian, replaying in her mind the image of him mounting that bay gelding and riding away beside the prince. The work from Mistress Helen provided some distraction during the afternoons and evenings. Eleanor threw herself into the mending with an almost desperate intensity, her needle flying through fabric as she executed repairs so meticulous they were nearly invisible. The merchant's husband's tunic required careful reweaving of torn threads in a way that would not show even upon close inspection, a task that demanded absolute concentration and left no room for worried thoughts. The daughter's dress needed not only the hem let down but also delicate adjustments to the bodice to accommodate a young woman's changing figure, work that required both skill and an understanding of how clothing should drape and move. But the cloak was the most challenging piece. The original lining had been silk, a luxury item that had probably cost more than Eleanor now earned in 6 months, and it had deteriorated beyond any hope of repair. Mistress Helen had provided new material for the replacement, a heavy cotton fabric in a deep burgundy color that would be warm and serviceable if not as elegant as the original silk. Eleanor had to carefully remove every stitch of the old lining without damaging the outer wool, then cut and fit the new material with absolute precision so that it would lie smooth and flat without bunching or pulling. The work kept her hands busy, but it could not quiet her mind. As her needle moved in and out of fabric in the dim light of her single candle, Eleanor's thoughts circled endlessly around Adrian and the dangers he might be facing on the northern borders. She had heard stories about the Scottish raiders, tales told by soldiers and travelers in the village taverns. They spoke of fierce warriors who struck without warning, burning and pillaging before disappearing back across the border like ghosts. They spoke of ambushes on mountain roads, of sieges that lasted weeks or months, of battles where men died by the dozens and their blood stained the heather red. Every sound in the night made Eleanor start from her work, her heart racing with irrational fear that somehow bad news had come, that someone was climbing the stairs to tell her Adrian had been killed or injured. She slept even more poorly than usual, waking at every creak of the old building's timbers, every gust of wind that rattled her shutters. When she did manage to fall into deeper sleep, her dreams were haunted by visions of her son lying wounded on some distant battlefield, calling for her while she remained trapped and helpless, unable to reach him. On the 4th day after Adrian's departure, Eleanor was sitting in the boarding house's common room working on Mistress Helen's cloak when Beatrice entered carrying a basket of vegetables from the market. The older woman paused when she saw Eleanor, her sharp eyes taking in the dark circles under the younger woman's eyes, the tremor in her hands that made her stitching less steady than usual, the general air of barely contained anxiety that surrounded her like a fog. "Eleanor," Beatrice said, setting down her basket and moving to sit on the bench beside her, "you are going to make yourself ill if you continue like this. I have never seen you in such a state. Please, talk to me. Tell me what has you so distressed." Eleanor's first instinct was to deflect, to insist that nothing was wrong beyond the usual struggles of daily survival. But the kindness in Beatrice's weathered face, the genuine concern in her pale blue eyes, broke through the walls Eleanor had built around her secrets. The words came spilling out before she could stop them. "My son," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "I have a son in the castle, a boy of 9 years named Adrian. He was taken from me 3 years ago after the plague. I have been watching him from the woods every morning, seeing him train with the other pages, just to know he is safe and well. But 4 days ago, the prince took him north to the border fortifications, and I am terrified that something will happen to him, that he will be hurt or killed, and I will never see him again." Beatrice sat in stunned silence for several long moments, processing this revelation. Then, slowly, she reached out and took one of Eleanor's trembling hands in both of her own. "Oh, my dear girl," she said softly, "you have been carrying this burden alone for 3 years? Watching your child from a distance, unable to speak to him or hold him. I cannot imagine the strength that must have required." Eleanor felt tears beginning to stream down her cheeks again, though she had thought herself cried out. "I feel so helpless," she admitted, her voice breaking. "He is everything to me, Beatrice. He is all I have left of the life I once knew, the only good thing the world has allowed me to keep, and even that I can only observe from afar. And now he has been taken into danger, and there is nothing I can do to protect him. I do not even have the right to know if he is safe. I am his mother, and yet I am nothing to him, less than nothing." "That is not true," Beatrice said firmly, squeezing Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. "You are his mother, and that bond cannot be severed by distance or time or circumstance. He may not know you are watching over him, but you are, faithfully, every single day. That matters, Eleanor. Your love matters, even if he cannot see it." She paused, then added more gently, "And as for the danger, well, the prince would not take children into true peril. This journey to the border is likely more about education than combat. The boy will see the fortifications, meet the border lords, learn about military strategy and diplomacy. He will be surrounded by experienced guards whose sole purpose is to keep him and the other pages safe. You must trust in that." Eleanor wanted to believe Beatrice's reassurances, wanted to let them soothe the constant ache of worry that had taken up residence in her chest. "But what if something goes wrong?" she asked, voicing the fear that haunted her every waking moment. "What if raiders attack despite the guards? What if there is an accident, a fall from a horse, a sudden illness? I would not know until weeks after it happened, if I ever found out at all." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "You are right," she finally said. "You might not know immediately if something happened, but Eleanor, that has been true every day since your son was taken into the castle. Any day, illness or accident could have befallen him, and you would have been just as helpless to prevent it or even know about it right away. The only thing that has changed is your awareness of the possibility. The actual risk to him may be no greater now than it was last week or last month." It was a logical argument, and somewhere in the rational part of her mind, Eleanor recognized the truth in it, but logic had very little power over the primal fear a mother felt for her child. Still, Beatrice's words did provide a small measure of comfort, enough to help Eleanor take a deep breath and try to compose herself. "You are very wise," Eleanor said, managing a weak smile through her tears. "Thank you for listening and for not thinking me foolish." "Never foolish," Beatrice assured her. "A mother's love is the most powerful force in this world. It can survive anything, endure anything. I know this because I was a mother once too, before the plague took my children from me. I understand what you feel, Eleanor, and I want you to know that you are not alone in this, not anymore. I will help you bear this burden however I can." The two women sat together in silence for a while, Eleanor's hands still clasped in Beatrice's weathered ones, drawing strength from the simple human connection. Finally, Eleanor gently withdrew her hand and returned to her work on the cloak, her stitches steadier now, her breathing calmer. Beatrice watched her for a few minutes, then rose and went about her own tasks. But the atmosphere in the room had changed, become warmer somehow, less lonely. That evening, Eleanor completed the work on Mistress Helen's cloak and set it aside with the other finished garments, ready to be delivered in the morning. She had done excellent work despite her emotional turmoil, and she allowed herself a small moment of pride in her craftsmanship. It was such a little thing, being skilled with a needle, but it was hers, something no one could take from her, and it provided a measure of dignity and purpose even in her reduced circumstances. The next morning, Eleanor carried the bundle of mended garments to the cloth merchant's shop in the market square. Mistress Helen examined each piece with a critical eye, holding them up to the light, running her fingers over the repaired areas, testing the drape and fall of the fabrics. Finally, she nodded her approval. "This is exceptional work, Mistress Eleanor. The tear in my husband's tunic is completely invisible. The dress fits as though it were made new for my daughter's current measurements, and the cloak's lining is perfect. You have more than earned your fee." She counted out the remaining 4 pennies, then added an additional 2. "For work of this quality, you deserve a bonus. I will certainly keep you in mind for future mending needs, and I will recommend you to my friends and acquaintances who may require such services." Eleanor accepted the coins with gratitude that went beyond their monetary value. The recommendation could lead to more regular work, perhaps even enough to improve her circumstances slightly, to afford a better room or warmer clothing for the coming winter. As Eleanor walked back toward the boarding house, the coins secure in her pocket, she decided on an impulse to detour through the village market. It was market day, and the square was crowded with farmers and craftsmen selling their wares from wooden stalls and carts. The air was filled with the mingled scents of fresh bread, roasted meat, herbs and spices, leather and wool. Voices called out, advertising goods and haggling over prices, creating a cheerful cacophony that was almost overwhelming after the quiet isolation of Eleanor's usual routine. Eleanor stopped at a baker's stall and purchased a small loaf of bread, still warm from the oven and fragrant with the yeasty smell of fresh baking. It was an extravagance, as she normally bought day-old bread for half the price, but somehow the small indulgence felt necessary, a tiny assertion of her continued humanity in the face of all that had been taken from her. She also bought a wedge of cheese and a handful of early apples, their skins still green but promising the tartness she remembered from childhood autumns. As she was placing her purchases in her basket, Eleanor became aware of a commotion near the market's entrance. A rider had arrived, his horse lathered with sweat as though it had been ridden hard for many miles. The man was shouting something, his words initially lost in the general noise of the market, but gradually the crowd fell silent as people turned to listen. Eleanor's heart began to pound with a terrible premonition, even before she could make out what the rider was saying. "News from the north," the messenger called out, his voice hoarse from shouting and riding. "The prince's company was attacked by Scottish raiders 3 days' ride from the border." There was a skirmish. Casualties on both sides. The crowd erupted in exclamations of shock and concern, people pressing forward to hear more details. Eleanor felt the world tilting around her, her vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. Her basket fell from nerveless fingers, the bread and cheese and apples spilling onto the muddy ground, but she did not notice. She pushed through the crowd with desperate urgency, not caring whom she shoved aside or what propriety demanded. She had to know. She had to hear what had happened to Adrian. When she reached the messenger, a young man in the king's livery who looked exhausted and troubled, she grabbed his arm with a grip that made him wince. "The pages," she demanded, her voice raw with terror. "What happened to the pages who were traveling with the prince? Were any of them hurt?" The messenger looked at her with some surprise, perhaps taken aback by the intensity of her question, or by the wildness he saw in her eyes. "I do not know specifics about all the pages, mistress," he said more gently, seeming to recognize genuine anguish when he saw it. "I know that the prince himself was wounded in the fighting, though not gravely. Several guards were killed or injured. As for the pages—" He hesitated, and Eleanor felt her heart stop beating entirely. "As for the pages, I know that at least one was hurt during the attack, but I do not have details about which one or how seriously. The prince's company has taken shelter in a fortified manor house and sent me ahead to bring news and request additional guards and a healer." Eleanor released the messenger's arm and stumbled backward, her legs barely able to support her weight. Someone in the crowd caught her before she fell, steadying her with firm hands. The voices around her seemed to come from very far away, distorted and meaningless. Adrian might be hurt. Adrian might be dying. Adrian might already be dead, and she was here in this market square, helpless and useless, unable to do anything to help him, or even to know his fate. "Mistress, are you unwell?" The voice belonged to a woman Eleanor vaguely recognized from the village, but she could not focus enough to identify her. "Should I fetch someone to help you home?" Eleanor shook her head, though the motion made the world spin alarmingly. "No," she managed to say through numb lips. "No, I can manage. I need to sit down for a moment." The woman guided Eleanor to a low wall bordering the market square and helped her sit. Someone brought her a cup of water, which she drank without tasting. Gradually, the roaring in her ears subsided, and her vision cleared enough to see the concerned faces of the villagers gathered around her. They probably thought her mad, This poor fallen woman who had reacted to news of distant battle as though it were a personal catastrophe. And they were right, she realized with a bitter internal laugh. She was mad, driven to the edges of sanity by years of grief and loss and helpless love. After several minutes, Eleanor felt steady enough to stand. She thanked the villagers who had assisted her, retrieved her fallen basket and what remained of her scattered purchases, and made her way back to the boarding house on shaking legs. Beatrice met her at the door, having heard about the commotion in the market square, and helped her up to her room without asking questions that Eleanor was in no state to answer. Once alone, Eleanor collapsed onto her bed and stared at the rough wooden ceiling, her mind a chaotic whirl of fear and desperate hope. She knew, with the cold certainty that comes from hard experience, that there was nothing she could do. She could not ride to the north to find Adrian. She had no horse, no money for such a journey, no knowledge of where exactly the prince's company had taken shelter, no right to demand information or access even if she could somehow reach them. She was utterly, completely powerless. And yet, lying there in her tiny room as the afternoon light faded toward evening, Eleanor made a decision. She could not go to Adrian, could not help him or protect him or even know if he lived or died. But she could pray. She could petition every saint and holy figure she had ever heard of, could offer up her own suffering as a bargaining chip with the divine, could plead with God himself to spare her son's life. Eleanor rose from her bed, knelt on the hard wooden floor and began to pray with an intensity that bordered on fury. She prayed through the evening and into the night, her knees growing numb and then painful against the unforgiving wood, her voice hoarse from whispered petitions. She promised anything and everything she could think of if only Adrian would be kept safe. She offered her own life in exchange for his, her soul, if such a trade were possible, every moment of happiness she might ever know in the future. When exhaustion finally overcame her in the darkest hours before dawn, Eleanor dreamed that she was walking through a garden filled with white roses, their petals luminous in moonlight that came from no visible source. And in that garden, she found Adrian, whole and well and smiling, reaching out his hand to her and calling her name in a voice filled with love and recognition. The days following the messenger's arrival stretched into a week of unbearable uncertainty. Eleanor continued her daily routine with mechanical precision, rising before dawn, walking to her vantage point in the forest, sitting on her log and staring at the empty training yard where Adrian's absence felt like a physical wound. The other pages went through their exercises, their young voices carrying across the morning air as they practiced sword forms and grappled in the dust, but Eleanor barely registered their presence. Her entire being was focused on waiting, on hoping, on listening for any scrap of news that might tell her whether her son lived or died. The village buzzed with rumors and speculation about the attack on the prince's company. Some said the Scottish raiders had been a small band, easily driven off after a brief skirmish. Others claimed it had been a major assault involving hundreds of warriors, that the prince himself had nearly been killed, that only his exceptional skill with a sword had saved the entire company from slaughter. Eleanor listened to all of it with desperate attention, trying to separate truth from exaggeration, but the conflicting accounts only increased her anxiety rather than relieving it. On the 8th day after the messenger's arrival, Eleanor was sitting in the common room of the boarding house, pretending to work on a mending job that had come from one of Beatrice's acquaintances, when she heard the sound of horses and many voices approaching from the direction of the castle. She dropped her needlework and rushed to the window, her heart hammering so hard it felt as though her ribs might crack. Through the small, warped glass panes, she could see a column of riders moving along the road, banners flying, armor glinting in the pale morning sunlight. Without conscious thought, Eleanor grabbed her shawl and ran from the boarding house, joining the stream of villagers who were emerging from their homes and shops to witness the prince's return. She pushed through the growing crowd with single-minded determination, trying to get close enough to see clearly, to count the riders, to search desperately for one particular auburn-haired boy among the mounted figures. The column was larger than it had been when it departed, reinforced by the additional guards who had been sent north after the messenger's arrival. Prince Edmund rode at the head of the company, sitting tall in his saddle despite a visible bandage wrapped around his left arm, and evidence of recent injury in the careful way he held himself. His face was grim but composed, showing none of the youthful exuberance Eleanor had noticed during his previous appearance. This was a man who had seen combat, who had faced death and survived, and the experience had etched itself into his features in subtle but unmistakable ways. Behind the prince rode the guards, some showing signs of injury themselves, bandages visible on arms and legs. One man with his head wrapped in linen that was stained with old blood. And then, in the middle of the formation, protected on all sides by armed men, Eleanor saw the pages. She counted them frantically, her lips moving silently. 5. There were 5 boys, when there should have been 6. One was missing. Terror so intense it felt like drowning seized Eleanor's entire body. She could not breathe, could not think, could barely remain standing. Which boy was missing? Where was Adrian? She strained to see the faces of the pages, but they were still too far away, their features indistinct in the morning light. The crowd around her was pressing closer, everyone trying to get a better view, and Eleanor felt herself being pushed and jostled, losing her vantage point. "Please," she gasped to the large man beside her, a blacksmith she recognized from the market. "Please, I need to see. Let me through." The blacksmith glanced down at her, saw something in her face that moved him to pity, and used his considerable bulk to create a small space for her at the edge of the crowd. From there, as the column drew closer, Eleanor finally got a clear view of the pages. The first boy she recognized was Timothy, the youngest of the group at only 7 years old, his round face tear-stained and frightened. The second was Geoffrey, a stocky boy of 11 with straw-colored hair. The third and fourth were brothers, dark-haired and so similar in appearance that Eleanor had always had trouble telling them apart. And the fifth, Eleanor's vision swam with relief so overwhelming she felt her legs buckle beneath her. The fifth was Adrian. He was alive. He was sitting upright in his saddle, holding the reins with both hands, his eyes forward, and his jaw set with determination. But even from a distance, Eleanor could see that he was injured. His left sleeve was torn and stained with blood, and he held that arm close to his body in a way that suggested significant pain. His face was pale beneath the dirt and grime of travel, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of exhaustion and suffering. But he was alive. That was all that mattered in that moment. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, silent sobs shaking her shoulders as relief and residual fear warred within her chest. She wanted to run to him, to pull him from his horse and hold him until the trembling in her own body subsided, to examine his injury and tend to it with her own hands, to assure herself that he was truly safe. But of course she could do none of those things. She could only stand in the crowd with all the other villagers, watching as the prince's company passed by on their way to the castle gates. As the riders drew level with where Eleanor stood, something remarkable happened. Adrian's head turned, his amber eyes scanning the crowd of villagers lining the road, and for the second time in as many weeks, his gaze found hers across the distance. This time there was no confusion in his expression, no uncertainty. His eyes widened with unmistakable recognition, and Eleanor saw his lips form a single word, though no sound reached her ears through the noise of horses and crowd. "Mother." The moment stretched and contracted simultaneously, lasting both an eternity and no time at all. Eleanor saw shock flash across Adrian's features, followed by a complex mixture of emotions she could not entirely parse. Joy, confusion, pain, longing, anger perhaps, or maybe just the overwhelming bewilderment of a child confronted with something he had thought lost forever. His hand lifted slightly from his saddle, as if he might wave or call out, but then the column moved forward, carrying him past Eleanor's position and toward the castle gates. Eleanor remained rooted to the spot long after the last rider had passed through the gates and disappeared from view. The crowd around her began to disperse, people returning to their daily tasks with excited chatter about the prince's return and speculation about what had happened during the attack. But Eleanor stood unmoving, her mind replaying that moment of recognition over and over, analyzing every nuance of Adrian's expression, trying to understand what it meant. He had recognized her. After 3 years of separation, after being told she was probably dead or had abandoned him, after growing and changing in ways that must have altered his memories of her, he had still known her face. The implications of that recognition were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. What would Adrian do with that knowledge? Would he try to seek her out? Would he tell someone in the castle that he had seen his mother alive in the village? Would that bring consequences Eleanor could not predict or control? Eleanor. Beatrice's voice cut through her tumultuous thoughts. The older woman had followed her from the boarding house and now stood at her elbow, concern written plainly across her weathered features. "Come back inside, girl. You are shaking like a leaf in a storm. Whatever happened just now, you need to sit down and collect yourself before you collapse in the street." Eleanor allowed herself to be led back to the boarding house, up the stairs, and into her small room. Beatrice helped her sit on the bed, then went to fetch water and some bread and cheese, insisting that Eleanor eat something despite her protests that she could not possibly swallow anything in her current state. But under Beatrice's stern supervision, Eleanor managed a few bites of bread and some sips of water, and gradually felt a measure of stability return to her body if not her mind. "He saw me," Eleanor whispered, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "Adrian, my son. He looked directly at me, and I know he recognized me. I saw it in his face, Beatrice. He knows I am alive now." Beatrice sat down beside her on the narrow bed, taking Eleanor's cold hands in her own warm ones. "And is that such a terrible thing?" she asked gently. "The boy is old enough to understand some of what has happened to separate you. Perhaps knowing you are alive, knowing you still care, will bring him comfort rather than distress." Eleanor shook her head, anxiety tightening her throat. "You do not understand. If he tries to contact me, if he tells someone in the castle that he saw me, it could bring trouble for both of us. I am forbidden from the castle grounds because of William's debts. My presence, my attempt to maintain any connection to Adrian, could be seen as improper or even as some sort of scheme to reclaim status I no longer possess. They might take measures to keep him from me more completely, might move him somewhere I cannot watch him, or worse, they might punish him for my transgressions. Or," Beatrice countered firmly, "they might do none of those things. You are borrowing trouble that may never come, Eleanor. For now your son knows you are alive and that you care enough to be present, even from a distance. Let that knowledge settle before you imagine disasters that may never occur." She paused, then added more softly, "Besides, the boy looked injured. Your first concern should be for his recovery, not for hypothetical consequences that may or may not materialize." The mention of Adrian's injury brought Eleanor's focus sharply back to that terrible image. His pale face, his blood-stained sleeve, the way he had held his injured arm close to his body. "I wish I knew how badly he was hurt," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wish I could see him. Speak to the healers who are treating him. Know that he is receiving proper care. It is torture to be so close and yet so completely unable to help him." Over the next several days, Eleanor haunted the edges of the castle grounds like a restless spirit, desperately seeking any information about Adrian's condition. She questioned servants who came to the village market, asked travelers if they had heard anything about the pages who had been injured in the Scottish attack, listened to every scrap of gossip and rumor with an attention that bordered on obsession. The fragments of information she managed to gather were frustratingly vague and often contradictory, but gradually a picture began to emerge. The attack had indeed been a serious affair, not the minor skirmish some had suggested. A large band of Scottish raiders, perhaps 40 or 50 strong, had ambushed the prince's company on a narrow mountain road, using the terrain to their advantage. The battle had been fierce but relatively brief, the superior training and equipment of the prince's guards eventually driving the raiders off, but not before several men had been killed and many others wounded. Prince Edmund himself had taken a sword cut to his left arm that, while not life-threatening, would leave him with a prominent scar and had required extensive stitching by the company's healer. As for the pages, Eleanor learned that one boy, the youngest, Timothy, had not been injured in the fighting itself, but had fallen from his horse in the confusion and broken his leg. He was now confined to bed in the castle infirmary and would require months to heal properly. The missing page from the return journey had been Geoffrey, who had been killed when a Scottish blade had found the gap between his helmet and his armor, severing vital vessels in his neck. He had died within minutes, despite the frantic efforts of the healers, and his body had been buried with honor in the grounds of the fortified manor where the company had taken shelter. And Adrian, Eleanor finally learned from a serving woman who had a reputation for knowing everything that happened within the castle walls, had received a deep gash to his left forearm when he had instinctively raised his arm to protect his face from a raider's descending sword. The blow had been meant to kill, would have split his skull if it had landed as intended, but Adrian's quick reflexes and the fact that he had been wearing a helmet had saved his life. The wound to his arm had been serious, cutting through muscle and narrowly missing major blood vessels. But the prince's personal healer had cleaned and stitched it immediately, and there was every expectation that Adrian would recover full use of the limb with time and proper care. This last piece of information brought Eleanor a measure of relief so intense it left her lightheaded. Adrian would recover. He would heal. The injury was serious but not permanently crippling. She allowed herself for the first time in weeks to take a full breath without the crushing weight of terror pressing down on her chest. Her son had survived, had faced death and prevailed, and would carry a scar that marked him as someone who had been tested in battle while still barely more than a child. 2 weeks after the company's return, Eleanor resumed her daily vigil at her hidden vantage point in the forest. She arrived at her fallen log just as dawn was breaking, settling into her familiar position with a mixture of trepidation and hope. Would Adrian be among the page's training today? Would his injury prevent him from participating in physical exercises? Would he look toward the tree line again, seeking the mother he now knew was watching? The pages emerged from the castle as the sun climbed higher, Master Edmund leading them toward the training yard with his usual stern demeanor. Eleanor counted them anxiously. 4 boys today, not 5. Timothy was still recovering from his broken leg, and one space in the formation would forever remain empty now that Geoffrey had been laid to rest in the northern lands. But Adrian was there, standing tall despite the white bandage wrapped around his left forearm from elbow to wrist. He wore his practice tunic and breeches. His wooden practice sword hung from his belt, and though he was clearly favoring his injured arm, he moved with determination and purpose. Master Edmund called the boys to attention, his voice carrying across the training yard with its usual commanding tone. "I know you have all been through a terrible ordeal," he said, his gruff voice somehow gentler than usual. "You have seen combat, seen death, been wounded yourselves. These are harsh lessons for one so young, but they are lessons every warrior must learn eventually. You have proven yourselves brave and capable, and you have earned the respect of the prince himself and every guard who fought beside you." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued. "But surviving one battle does not make you finished with your training. If anything, it makes that training more important than ever. You now know what real combat feels like, know the chaos and fear and confusion of it. We will use that knowledge to make you better, stronger, more prepared for the next time you must face such dangers. And make no mistake, there will be a next time. Such is the life of a knight." Eleanor watched as Adrian absorbed these words, his young face serious and thoughtful. She could see the change in him, subtle but unmistakable. He stood differently now, with the awareness of his own mortality and capability that children who had not faced death could not possess. He had crossed some invisible threshold, had been forced to grow up in ways that should have taken years rather than moments. The knowledge made Eleanor's heart ache even as it filled her with pride. The training session began with exercises designed to accommodate the boys' various injuries and emotional states. Master Edmund had them working through sword forms at half speed, focusing on precision and technique rather than power or aggression. Adrian performed the movements with his right arm while keeping his left tucked against his body. But even one-handed, his form was excellent, each strike and parry executed with the grace of someone who had internalized the lessons through countless hours of practice. As the morning progressed, Eleanor noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. Adrian was looking toward the tree line, not constantly or obviously, but in brief glances whenever Master Edmund's attention was focused elsewhere. He was searching for her, Eleanor realized, trying to spot her among the shadows and foliage. The knowledge that he was seeking her presence, that he wanted to know she was there, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes even as it intensified her longing to cross the distance between them, to hold him and be held in return. During a brief rest period, while the other boys were drinking water and catching their breath, Adrian separated himself slightly from the group and moved to the edge of the training yard closest to Eleanor's hiding place. He stood there for a long moment, his back to Master Edmund and the others, his eyes clearly scanning the tree line, and then, slowly and deliberately, he raised his right hand and placed it over his heart in a gesture that was unmistakable in its meaning. It was acknowledgement, recognition, perhaps even love, communicated across the distance in the only way available to a boy who could not speak to his mother or approach her openly. Eleanor, her vision blurred by tears she could not control, mirrored the gesture, placing her own hand over her heart and holding it there, pouring all of her love and longing and pride into that simple movement. She did not know if Adrian could see her clearly enough to observe her response, but she made it anyway. A silent promise that she would always be there, always watching, always loving him, even if they could never be together as mother and son should be. The weeks following that silent exchange between Eleanor and Adrian fell into a new pattern, one that was both comforting and bittersweet in ways Eleanor had not anticipated. Each morning she made her pilgrimage to the forest clearing, and each morning, at some point during the training session, Adrian would find a moment to acknowledge her presence. Sometimes it was just a brief glance in her direction, his amber eyes seeking hers across the distance. Other times, when Master Edmund was distracted or occupied with another student, Adrian would make that gesture again, hand over heart, and Eleanor would mirror it from her hidden vantage point. These small exchanges sustained Eleanor in ways she could not fully articulate. They were proof that she had not been forgotten, that the bond between mother and son had survived years of separation and hardship. Adrian knew she was there. He looked for her. He acknowledged her. It was not the relationship they should have had, not the closeness of shared meals and bedtime stories and daily conversations, but it was something, a thread of connection that neither time nor circumstance had managed to completely sever. Adrian's injury healed with the resilience of youth. Within 3 weeks he was able to remove the bandage entirely, revealing a long, puckered scar that ran from just below his elbow to midway down his forearm. The scar tissue was still pink and tender, but the wound had closed cleanly with no signs of infection, testament to the skill of the prince's healer and Adrian's own robust constitution. Master Edmund gradually increased the demands on Adrian's training, first allowing him to hold a shield with his injured arm, then to execute two-handed sword techniques, until finally Adrian was participating fully in all exercises, with only occasional winces when a movement stretched the healing tissue in ways that were still uncomfortable. Eleanor watched her son's recovery with the fierce attention of someone who had no other purpose in life beyond this daily observation. She memorized every detail of his changing appearance, the way his features were maturing from childlike softness into the more defined structure that would characterize his adult face, the way his shoulders were broadening and his height increasing until he stood nearly as tall as some of the 14-year-old pages. He was growing up, and she was missing it, witnessing it only from a distance, like an audience member watching a performance rather than a participant in the actual events. The autumn deepened toward winter, the trees in the forest shedding their leaves until Eleanor's hiding place became less concealed. She had to move her observation point, finding a new spot further back among the evergreen pines where the year-round foliage provided better cover. The new location was not quite as advantageous, the angle slightly worse, the distance a bit greater, but it was still possible to see the training yard and to pick out Adrian among the other boys. The cold became more intense as November gave way to December. Eleanor's threadbare cloak provided inadequate protection against the bitter winds that swept down from the north, bringing with them the promise of snow and ice. Her morning walks to the forest became exercises in endurance, her fingers and toes going numb despite the strips of wool she wrapped around them, her breath forming clouds of vapor that hung in the still air. But she never missed a day, never allowed weather or discomfort to keep her from her vigil. It was during one of these frigid December mornings, with frost covering every surface and making the forest floor treacherous with ice, that Eleanor's life took another unexpected turn. She had settled into her new observation point among the pines, wrapping her cloak tightly around herself and trying to generate some warmth through sheer force of will, when she heard footsteps approaching through the forest behind her. Heavy footsteps, too deliberate and purposeful to be a deer or other forest creature. Eleanor's first instinct was to flee, to disappear deeper into the trees before whoever was approaching could discover her hiding place. But before she could move, a voice called out, stopping her in her tracks. "Mistress Ashford, please do not run. I mean you no harm. I only wish to speak with you." The voice was cultured, authoritative, unmistakably that of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Eleanor turned slowly, her heart hammering with fear and confusion, to find Prince Edmund standing perhaps 10 paces away among the frost-covered trees. He was dressed for riding, in heavy wool and leather with a fur-lined cloak thrown over his broad shoulders, but he wore no armor and carried no visible weapons beyond the sword that hung at his belt, which every nobleman wore as a matter of course. His expression was unreadable, gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made Eleanor feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that went beyond her discovery in this forbidden observation. "Your Highness," Eleanor managed to say, dropping into a curtsy despite her shaking legs. I did not mean to trespass. I know I should not be here. Please, I beg you, do not punish my son for my transgression. He had no knowledge of my presence. He is innocent of any wrongdoing." The prince held up one hand, a gesture that commanded silence without being overtly threatening. "Rise, Mistress Ashford. I am well aware that your son had no knowledge of your surveillance until recently, and I have no intention of punishing him for your actions. That is not why I am here." Eleanor straightened slowly, trying to read the prince's intentions in his face and finding only that same careful neutrality. "Then why are you here, Your Highness? How did you even know to find me in this place?" Prince Edmund moved closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, until he stood near enough that Eleanor could see the fine details of his features, the small scar on his left cheekbone from some long-ago injury, the silver threads already beginning to appear in his dark wheat-colored hair despite his youth, the intelligence and calculation in his gray eyes. "I have known of your presence here for some time," he said quietly. "Not from the beginning, but for perhaps the last 6 months. One of my guards, a man with exceptionally sharp eyes, noticed movement in the trees during the page's training sessions. He investigated and discovered you, but before he could report your presence as a potential security concern, I instructed him to observe you instead, to determine your purpose and whether you posed any actual threat to the castle or its inhabitants." Eleanor felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "And what did your guard determine, Your Highness?" The prince's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "He determined that you were a mother watching her child from a distance, never approaching, never interfering, simply observing. When I learned your identity, when I connected you to Adrian Ashford and learned the circumstances that had separated you from your son, I understood why you came here day after day, regardless of weather or hardship." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I also learned about your husband, Sir William Ashford, who served my father with distinction and died honorably during the plague. I learned about the debts that forced you from the castle, about your current circumstances in the village, and I made certain decisions based on that knowledge." Eleanor hardly dared to breathe, waiting for the prince to continue, uncertain whether his decisions would bring her deliverance or further disaster. "Adrian is an exceptional boy," Prince Edmund said, his voice taking on a note of genuine warmth. "He has natural talent as a warrior, but more importantly, he has courage, integrity, and loyalty. During the attack on our company, he placed himself between me and a Scottish blade, taking a wound that was meant for my throat. That boy, your son, saved my life at great risk to his own. I owe him a debt that can never be fully repaid, and by extension, I owe you as well, for bringing such a remarkable person into this world." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, though whether they were tears of pride, relief, or simply overwhelming emotion, she could not have said. "He saved your life?" she whispered. "I did not know. The reports I heard said only that he had been injured in the fighting, not that he had—" She could not finish the sentence, her voice failing entirely. The prince nodded gravely. "He did more than save my life. He demonstrated the kind of selfless valor that defines true knighthood. And when he recovered consciousness after the healers had tended his wound, do you know what his first words were?" Eleanor shook her head mutely. "He asked if everyone else was safe. Not about his own injury, not about the pain he was undoubtedly experiencing, but about the welfare of others. That is the measure of his character." Prince Edmund stepped even closer, close enough now that Eleanor could see the genuine emotion in his eyes, a combination of respect and something that looked almost like affection. "I want to help you, Mistress Ashford. I want to restore some of what was unjustly taken from you. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to be patient while I arrange matters in a way that will not create scandal or political complications that could ultimately harm both you and Adrian." Eleanor's mind reeled, struggling to process what the prince seemed to be suggesting. "Help me how, Your Highness? What could you possibly do to change circumstances that are fixed by law and debt and social station?" The prince smiled then, a small, enigmatic expression that hinted at plans and schemes Eleanor could not begin to guess. "Leave that to me. For now, I need you to continue exactly as you have been. Come to this forest each morning. Watch Adrian train. Maintain your current routine. But know that change is coming, and when it arrives, you must be ready to embrace it, regardless of how unexpected or unconventional it may seem. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, before she could ask any of the 1,000 questions clamoring in her mind, the prince turned and began walking back through the forest toward the castle. He paused after a few steps and looked back over his shoulder. One more thing, Mistress Ashford. Adrian knows you are alive now, knows you watch him from these woods. I have not told him of our conversation today, but I believe he takes comfort in your presence, even from a distance. Continue to give him that comfort. He will need it in the days to come. Then the prince was gone, disappearing among the trees with surprising quietness for such a large man, leaving Eleanor alone in the frozen forest with her thoughts in complete turmoil. What did he mean by help? What changes was he planning? And what did he mean about Adrian needing comfort in the days to come? Was there some new danger, some fresh trial that her son would have to face? Eleanor remained in the forest long after the training session had ended, long after Adrian and the other pages had returned to the castle for their midday meal and afternoon lessons. She sat on a fallen log, heedless of the cold that seeped through her thin cloak and dress, trying to make sense of everything the prince had told her. The Crown Prince of England had sought her out. He had known about her surveillance for months and had allowed it to continue. He claimed to owe Adrian a life debt and wanted to help Eleanor in some unspecified way. It felt too much like a dream, like one of the hopeful fantasies Eleanor had sometimes allowed herself during the darkest nights when despair threatened to overwhelm her entirely. But it had been real. The prince had been there, had spoken to her, had made promises that seemed impossible but had been delivered with such conviction that Eleanor could not entirely dismiss them as empty platitudes. When Eleanor finally returned to the village, she found Beatrice waiting for her in the common room of the boarding house, a concerned expression on her weathered face. "You were gone much longer than usual today," the older woman observed. "I was beginning to worry that you had taken ill or suffered some accident in the forest." Eleanor sank onto the bench beside Beatrice, suddenly exhausted in ways that went far beyond physical tiredness. "Something happened today," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot. "Something I never could have anticipated or imagined in my wildest dreams." She proceeded to tell Beatrice everything about her encounter with Prince Edmund, from his sudden appearance in the forest to his cryptic promises of help and change. Beatrice listened in silence, her sharp blue eyes never leaving Eleanor's face, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Eleanor finished her account, Beatrice sat quietly for several long moments, processing what she had heard. "This could be very good for you," she finally said slowly, "or it could bring complications you are not prepared to handle. Crown princes do not typically concern themselves with the welfare of impoverished widows, even widows of knights who once served the crown. There must be more to his interest than simple gratitude for your son's actions, however brave those actions may have been." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "What are you suggesting, Beatrice? Do you think the prince has some ulterior motive, some hidden agenda that could bring me harm?" The older woman shook her head thoughtfully. "Not harm necessarily, but princes live in a world of politics and strategy that common folk like us can barely comprehend. Every action they take serves multiple purposes, creates alliances or settles debts or positions pieces on a board we cannot even see. I am not saying you should distrust him, only that you should be cautious, should think carefully before accepting whatever help he offers." Eleanor absorbed this advice with the seriousness it deserved. Beatrice had survived 60 years in a world that was often cruel and capricious, had navigated loss and hardship with a combination of wisdom and pragmatism that Eleanor deeply respected. If the older woman counseled caution, then caution was warranted. "I will be careful," Eleanor promised. "I will not allow hope to blind me to potential dangers." "But Beatrice, what if the prince genuinely wants to help? What if this is the miracle I have been praying for all these years?" Beatrice reached out and clasped Eleanor's hand in both of her own. "Then accept his help with grace and gratitude, but keep your eyes open and your wits about you. Miracles are rare, Eleanor, and they often come with prices we do not anticipate paying." The older woman's words proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after Eleanor's encounter with Prince Edmund in the forest, a messenger arrived at the boarding house bearing a sealed letter addressed to Eleanor Ashford. The seal was the prince's own signet, a lion rampant impressed in red wax, and the sight of it made Eleanor's hands tremble as she accepted the letter from the messenger. She waited until she was alone in her room before breaking the seal and unfolding the heavy parchment. The letter was written in an elegant hand, the letters precisely formed and easy to read despite Eleanor's limited literacy. She had to sound out several of the longer words, but the message was clear enough. Mistress Ashford, I request your presence at the castle 3 days hence, at the 10th hour of the morning. You are to present yourself at the main gates and inform the guards that you have been summoned by Prince Edmund. They will escort you to my private chambers, where we shall discuss matters of mutual interest and benefit. Come dressed as well as your circumstances allow, and bring with you any documentation regarding your late husband's debts and your eviction from the castle. This is not a request that may be declined. Edmund, Crown Prince of England. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each reading. She was being summoned to the castle, to the prince's private chambers, to discuss matters of mutual interest and benefit. What could that possibly mean? And why did she need to bring documentation about William's debts? What was the prince planning? The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Eleanor took her remaining pennies and purchased cloth to make herself a new dress, something that would be presentable enough for an audience with royalty, without being so fine as to seem presumptuous given her current station. She worked through 2 nights with barely any sleep, her needle flying through the fabric as she constructed a simple gown of dark blue wool with modest embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It was not grand, but it was clean and well made and would not shame her in the prince's presence. She also searched through her small trunk for the papers related to William's debts, documents she had kept despite having no idea why, perhaps simply because they were one of the few tangible remnants of her previous life. The creditor's demands, the itemized lists of what had been seized and sold, the final notice of eviction from the castle premises, all were there, yellowed and creased from years of storage but still legible. On the morning of the appointed day, Eleanor rose before dawn and prepared herself with meticulous care. She washed thoroughly in cold water, braided her hair and pinned it in a style that was both neat and appropriate for someone of her former station, and dressed in her new blue gown. Looking at herself in the small, warped piece of polished metal that served as her mirror, Eleanor barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked almost respectable again, almost like the person she had been before the plague had stolen everything. Beatrice insisted on walking with her to the castle gates, providing both moral support and a steadying presence that helped keep Eleanor's nerves from overwhelming her entirely. As they approached the massive stone fortress, Eleanor felt her steps slowing, old memories of being forced from these walls, warring with hope for what the future might bring. At the gates, Eleanor presented herself to the guards as instructed, her voice only shaking slightly as she informed them of the prince's summons. The guards examined the letter she still carried, verified the authenticity of the prince's seal, and then, to Eleanor's amazement, treated her with a respect she had not experienced in years. One guard was dispatched to escort her into the castle, while another offered polite words about the weather and the hope that her meeting would go well. Eleanor followed the guard through corridors she had not walked in 3 years, her heart pounding with each step on the familiar stone floors. The castle seemed both exactly as she remembered and subtly different, as though she were seeing it through eyes that had been irrevocably changed by hardship and loss. They passed servants who glanced at her curiously, nobles who did not even acknowledge her presence, and guards who stood at attention as they walked by. The guard leading her maintained a respectful silence, allowing Eleanor to compose herself as they climbed a winding staircase that led to the upper levels of the castle, where the royal family's private chambers were located. Finally, they reached a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands and decorated with the royal crest carved in relief. The guard knocked twice, a solid sound that echoed in the stone corridor, and a voice from within called out permission to enter. The guard opened the door, gestured for Eleanor to step inside, then withdrew and closed the door behind her, leaving her alone in Prince Edmund's private chamber. The room was large, but not ostentatiously so, furnished with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of wealth and power without needing to loudly proclaim it. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blazing with a fire that filled the room with welcome warmth. Rich tapestries depicting hunting scenes and historical battles hung on the walls, their colors still vibrant despite obvious age. A large desk of dark wood stood near the window, its surface covered with documents and maps and writing implements. Several comfortable chairs upholstered in deep red velvet were arranged near the fireplace, and it was in one of these that Prince Edmund sat, rising smoothly to his feet as Eleanor entered. "Mistress Ashford," he greeted her with a slight bow that was far more courtesy than her current station warranted. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from his own. "We have much to discuss, and I suspect you have many questions." Eleanor moved to the indicated chair and sat carefully, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, the papers she had brought clutched in nervous fingers. The prince resumed his own seat and studied her for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "First," he began, "I want to assure you that what we discuss here today will remain private unless you choose to share it with others. You have my word as a prince and as a man of honor that nothing you say or do here will be used against you or your son." Eleanor managed a nod, her throat too tight with tension to trust her voice. The prince continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "I have spent the past 3 days investigating the debts that led to your eviction from the castle and the seizure of your possessions. What I discovered troubled me greatly. The amounts you were said to owe were grossly inflated by the creditors, who took advantage of your husband's death and your vulnerable position to claim far more than was actually owed. Furthermore, much of what was seized and sold was worth considerably more than what you were credited with, the difference disappearing into the creditors' pockets rather than being applied to reduce the debt." Eleanor felt anger stirring in her chest, hot and bitter. "I suspected as much at the time, Your Highness, but I had no way to prove it, and no recourse to challenge their claims. A widow with no family and no powerful allies is easy prey for those who would take advantage." Prince Edmund nodded grimly. "Indeed, and that injustice compounds the tragedy of what was already a terrible situation. However, I have means at my disposal that you did not. I have had my legal advisors examine every transaction, every seizure, every payment. The documents you brought will be helpful in completing that examination." He held out his hand, and Eleanor placed the yellowed papers into it, watching as he quickly scanned through them with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reviewing complex documents. After several minutes, he set them aside and looked back at Eleanor with an expression that held both satisfaction and what might have been righteous anger. "As I suspected," he said firmly, "the creditors committed fraud on a significant scale. According to my calculations based on the actual amounts owed, the value of what was seized from you, and the prevailing market prices at the time, you should have owed nothing after the first round of seizures. Everything taken after that point was outright theft, dressed up in legal language to make it appear legitimate." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, though whether they were tears of vindication or renewed grief for what had been stolen from her, she could not say. "But what does that mean, Your Highness? The past cannot be undone. What was taken is long since sold and dispersed. Even if you could prove fraud, which I assume would be difficult after so much time has passed, it would not restore what I have lost." The prince leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense. "You are correct that we cannot undo the past, but we can address its consequences and create a better future. I have used my authority to investigate the creditors who defrauded you. 2 of them are now facing charges for similar fraudulent practices against other widows and orphans. Their assets are being seized by the crown, and those assets will be used to provide restitution to their victims." He paused, letting this information sink in before continuing. "As one of those victims, you are entitled to restitution. I have calculated that you are owed approximately 100 gold sovereigns based on what was illegally taken from you. That is a substantial sum, Mistress Ashford, enough to restore you to comfort, if not to your previous station." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. 100 gold sovereigns. It was more money than she had ever possessed at one time, more than she could earn in 10 years of taking in mending. It was enough to rent a proper house, to buy decent clothing and furniture, to live without the constant gnawing fear of starvation or homelessness. But even as hope surged in her chest, doubt followed close behind. "Your Highness, I am grateful beyond words for your investigation and for seeking justice on my behalf. But I must ask, why? Why would you go to such lengths for someone like me? Surely the Crown Prince of England has more pressing concerns than the fraudulent debts of one impoverished widow." Prince Edmund's expression softened, and for a moment he looked younger, less like a prince and more like a young man grappling with complex emotions. "Several reasons," he said quietly. "First, because your husband served my father with honor and loyalty, and the crown owes a debt to those who sacrifice in its service. Second, because your son saved my life, and I can never repay that debt adequately, but I can at least ensure his mother does not live in poverty and deprivation. And third, he hesitated, then continued with what seemed like careful honesty, because I have come to care for Adrian as more than just another page in training. He reminds me of what I might have been if I had not been born to rule, if I had been free to simply be brave and good without the weight of a kingdom on my shoulders. The prince stood and walked to the window, looking out over the castle grounds where, Eleanor realized, the training yard would be visible. "I have no siblings," he said, his back to Eleanor. "No brothers or sisters, no close family beyond my parents. Adrian has become something like a younger brother to me, someone I want to protect and guide and see succeed. Is it so strange that I would want to help his mother, who has suffered so much and asked for nothing, who has watched her son from the shadows for years without ever demanding recognition or recompense?" Eleanor rose from her chair, moved by the emotion in the prince's voice. "Your Highness, I do not know what to say. Your kindness is overwhelming, but I worry about accepting such generosity. What will people think? What complications might it create for you or for Adrian?" The prince turned from the window, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let me worry about what people think. I am the crown prince. I have substantial latitude in how I choose to distribute crown funds for purposes of justice and restitution. As for complications, well, that brings me to the second matter I wish to discuss with you." He returned to his chair and gestured for Eleanor to resume her seat as well. Once they were both settled, he continued in a more formal tone. "The restitution I mentioned will be paid to you in installments over the next year, both to avoid drawing excessive attention and to allow you time to establish yourself in a more stable situation. However, I have another proposal that I hope you will consider carefully before accepting or declining." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, anxiety returning in force. "What proposal, Your Highness?" The prince took a deep breath as if steeling himself for something difficult. "I would like to offer you a position within the castle household. Specifically, I would like you to serve as the head of the page's household, overseeing their daily needs, their health and welfare, their moral and ethical education in matters that go beyond martial training. It is a position that currently does not exist, but one that I believe is sorely needed, particularly after the recent tragedy that claimed young Geoffrey's life." Eleanor stared at him in stunned disbelief. "You want me to live in the castle? To work here? But Your Highness, surely there would be objections. I was evicted from these premises. People know of my fallen circumstances. How could I possibly return in a position of authority over noble-born children?" Prince Edmund's expression became firm, almost stern. "You were evicted because of fraudulent debts that have now been proven false. Your husband was a knight of honor. You yourself are of gentle birth, and you have skills and experience that make you uniquely qualified for this position. As for objections, I am the crown prince, and I am offering you this position. Anyone who objects will answer to me personally." He leaned forward, his gray eyes locked on Eleanor's amber ones. "More importantly, this position would allow you to be near Adrian, to see him daily, to have some part in his life again. You would not be his mother openly, not at first. The transition must be gradual to avoid shocking the boy or creating scandal. But you would be there, Mistress Ashford. You would be present in his life in a way you have not been able to be for 3 long years. Is that not worth any discomfort or awkwardness the situation might create?" Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face now, hot and uncontrolled. To be near Adrian, to see him every day, not from a distance through trees and shadows, but in the same rooms, the same corridors, to speak with him, even if only in her official capacity, to watch him grow and learn and become the man he was meant to be. The temptation was so strong it was almost painful. "What about Adrian?" she managed to ask through her tears. "Does he know of this plan? What will he think when he sees me here, working in the castle? How should we?" She could not finish the question, could not even articulate what she was trying to ask. But the prince seemed to understand. "I have not told Adrian yet," he said gently. "I wanted to speak with you first, to ensure you would accept the position before raising hopes that might be dashed. But I plan to tell him today, after our meeting concludes. I will explain that his mother is alive, that she has been watching over him, and that she will now be joining the castle household in an official capacity. He paused, then added with careful emphasis, "How you and Adrian navigate your relationship from that point forward will be up to the two of you. I will not force anything or create artificial constraints beyond what propriety and your position require. If you wish to reveal yourself as his mother immediately, that is your choice. If you prefer to allow the relationship to develop gradually, to let him become accustomed to your presence before claiming him as your son, that is also acceptable. I trust you to know what is best for your child." Eleanor wiped at her tears with shaking hands, trying to compose herself enough to think clearly. This was everything she had dreamed of and more, the answer to prayers she had whispered in darkness for 3 years. But it was also terrifying in its implications. Could she really step back into the world of the castle, the world of nobles and servants and complex social hierarchies? Could she navigate the politics and gossip and scrutiny that would inevitably come with such a dramatic change in circumstances? She thought of Adrian, of the way his eyes had sought hers in the training yard, of that gesture he made with his hand over his heart. She thought of all the mornings she had sat in the cold forest, watching from a distance, longing for even a moment of true connection with her son. And she knew, despite all her fears and doubts, that there was only one answer she could possibly give. "I accept," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. "I accept your offer of restitution, and I accept the position you have created for me. I will serve to the best of my abilities, and I will—" Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. "I will be so grateful for the chance to be part of my son's life again, even in this limited capacity. Thank you, Your Highness. Thank you for seeing what was done to me, for seeking justice, for caring about Adrian, for giving me back some measure of what was stolen. I will never be able to repay such kindness." Prince Edmund smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his usually serious features. "You have already repaid it, Mistress Ashford, by raising a son worthy of admiration and emulation. Now, let us discuss the practical details of your new position. You will be provided with chambers in the West Wing, near the page's dormitory, but separate enough to maintain proper propriety. You will have a modest allowance for clothing and personal needs, and you will take your meals with the castle household staff, unless specifically invited to join the nobles' table for formal occasions." Over the next hour, the prince laid out the specifics of Eleanor's new role and responsibilities. She would oversee the pages' daily routines outside of their martial training, ensuring they maintained clean living quarters, attended to their studies in reading and writing and mathematics, received proper medical attention when ill or injured, and developed the kind of character and moral foundation that would serve them well as future knights. It was a significant responsibility, but one that Eleanor felt confident she could fulfill, drawing on her own education and her experience managing a household during her marriage to William. When all the details had been discussed and agreed upon, Prince Edmund summoned a scribe to draw up the formal documents appointing Eleanor to her new position. While they waited for the paperwork to be completed, the prince asked Eleanor about her life over the past 3 years, listening with genuine interest as she described her daily routines, her work as a seamstress, her friendship with Beatrice. He seemed particularly moved by her account of the daily vigils in the forest, shaking his head in wonder at her dedication and perseverance. "You are a remarkable woman, Mistress Ashford," he said when she had finished. "Most people would have been broken by what you endured. The fact that you not only survived but maintained your dignity and your love for your son speaks to a strength of character that is all too rare in this world." Eleanor felt herself blushing at the praise. "I did what any mother would do, Your Highness. Adrian is my son. Nothing could make me stop loving him or wanting to be near him, regardless of the obstacles placed in my path." The scribe arrived with the completed documents, which both Eleanor and the prince signed and sealed. Eleanor was given a copy for her own records, along with a purse containing 20 gold sovereigns as the first installment of her restitution. The weight of the coins in her hand felt surreal, like something from a dream that might dissolve if she held them too tightly. "You may move into your chambers tomorrow," Prince Edmund informed her. "I will have servants prepare the rooms today and ensure they are furnished appropriately for someone of your new station. For now, return to the village and settle your affairs there. Say your farewells to those who have been kind to you, particularly Mistress Beatrice, who sounds like a woman of rare compassion and wisdom." Eleanor nodded, clutching the purse of gold coins and her copy of the appointment documents. "I will, Your Highness, and I will return tomorrow prepared to begin my new duties." She hesitated, then added softly, "Will Adrian truly know by then? Will you have told him about me?" The prince's expression became gentle. "I will tell him this very afternoon, during our regular meeting. By the time you arrive tomorrow, he will know that his mother lives, that she has been watching over him, and that she will now be part of the castle household. How he processes that information, what emotions he experiences, I cannot predict. But he will know, and he will have tonight to prepare himself for seeing you." Eleanor felt her heart clenching with a mixture of hope and terror. What if Adrian was angry that she had watched him from hiding for so long without revealing herself? What if he felt betrayed or abandoned? What if the years of separation had damaged their bond beyond repair? The prince seemed to sense her anxiety. "Have faith, Mistress Ashford. From what I have observed of Adrian's character, he is capable of great understanding and compassion. Give him time to adjust, and trust that the love between mother and son is stronger than any circumstance that might seek to divide them." Eleanor was escorted back to the castle gates by the same guard who had brought her to the prince's chambers. As she stepped out into the winter sunlight, clutching her precious documents and purse of gold, she felt as though she were stepping into an entirely new life. The world looked different somehow, brighter and full of possibility in ways it had not been since before the plague had stolen everything from her. She walked back to the village in a daze, barely noticing the cold or the distance. When she reached the boarding house, she found Beatrice waiting anxiously in the common room, clearly having spent the entire morning worrying about how Eleanor's meeting with the prince would conclude. The older woman's face transformed with relief and joy when Eleanor told her everything that had transpired. From the revelation about the fraudulent debts, to the offer of restitution, to the position in the castle household. "Oh, my dear girl," Beatrice said, pulling Eleanor into a fierce embrace that smelled of wood smoke and herbs and kindness. "I am so happy for you, so very happy. You deserve this, Eleanor. You deserve to have your son back, to have some comfort and security after all you have endured." Eleanor returned the embrace, tears flowing again, realizing how much she would miss this woman who had shown her such consistent compassion. "I will never forget your kindness, Beatrice," Eleanor whispered against the older woman's shoulder. "You gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. You listened when I needed someone to hear me. You offered wisdom when I was lost. I will always be grateful." Beatrice pulled back, holding Eleanor at arm's length and studying her with those sharp blue eyes. "You are going to do wonderfully in your new position. Those boys will be lucky to have you watching over them. And Adrian. Oh, Eleanor, I cannot imagine the joy he must feel right now, learning that his mother is alive and will be near him again." Eleanor spent the rest of the day settling her affairs in the village. She paid Beatrice everything she owed for rent, plus a generous extra amount as a gift of gratitude. She visited Mistress Helen to explain that she would no longer be available for mending work, though she promised to recommend another seamstress she knew to be skilled and reliable. She packed her few belongings into the same small trunk she had carried when first evicted from the castle 3 years earlier, though this time the packing was accompanied by hope rather than despair. That evening, Eleanor stood at the window of her tiny room, looking out at the darkening sky and thinking about Adrian. By now, Prince Edmund would have told him. By now, her son would know the truth about the shadowy figure who had watched him from the forest, would understand that his mother had never abandoned him, had never stopped loving him, had been present in the only way circumstances allowed. What was he thinking in this moment? Was he happy, angry, confused, relieved? Eleanor prayed that night with the same intensity she had shown during the days after learning of the attack on the prince's company. But this time her prayers were not desperate pleas for her son's survival. They were prayers of thanksgiving, of gratitude for the unexpected miracle that had restored to her what she thought lost forever. She thanked God for Prince Edmund's kindness, for Adrian's bravery and the debt it had created, for the investigation that had revealed the truth about the fraudulent debts, for this second chance to be part of her son's life. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the winter sun painting the frost-covered world in shades of gold and pink. Eleanor dressed in her best clothing, the blue wool dress she had made for her meeting with the prince, and gathered her belongings. Beatrice helped her carry the trunk downstairs, and together they walked to the castle. Two women who had found friendship in hardship, saying a goodbye that was bittersweet in its mixture of joy and sorrow. At the castle gates, Eleanor embraced Beatrice one final time. "Visit me," she urged. "Once I am settled in my new position, come to the castle and let me show you my chambers. Let me introduce you to Adrian properly. You are part of this story, Beatrice. You helped me survive when survival seemed impossible." Beatrice nodded, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "I will visit, but for now, go. Go and reclaim your life. Eleanor Ashford. Go and be the mother your son has been missing all these years." Eleanor was escorted to her new chambers in the West Wing by a kind-faced servant woman who introduced herself as Margaret. The rooms were modest but infinitely nicer than anything Eleanor had inhabited in the past 3 years. There was a proper bedroom with a real bed and thick blankets, a small sitting room with a desk and chairs, and even a tiny private alcove with a basin for washing. A fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, and the windows, glazed with real glass rather than just shutters, looked out over the castle's herb garden. "The prince wanted you to be comfortable," Margaret explained as she helped Eleanor unpack her meager belongings into the sturdy wooden wardrobe that stood against one wall. "He also arranged for these." She gestured to several dresses hanging in the wardrobe, far finer than Eleanor's simple blue wool. "He thought you might need appropriate clothing for your new position. The seamstresses worked through the night to have them ready for your arrival." Eleanor ran her fingers over the rich fabrics, quality wool and linen in deep jewel tones that would be suitable for someone of her new station without being ostentatiously grand. There were also warm cloaks, sturdy shoes, even undergarments and nightgowns. Prince Edmund had thought of everything, had ensured she would have what she needed to step into her new role with dignity and confidence. Once Eleanor was settled, Margaret explained that she would have the morning to adjust to her surroundings, but that in the afternoon she was expected to meet with Master Edmund, the weapons master, to discuss how her responsibilities would coordinate with his training schedule for the pages. The pages themselves would be introduced to her formally the following morning, giving both Eleanor and Adrian one more night to prepare themselves for their reunion. Eleanor spent the morning exploring her new domain, familiarizing herself with the pages' dormitory, the rooms where they took their meals and attended their academic lessons, the small chapel where they were expected to pray each morning and evening. She met some of the castle staff who would be working under her supervision, kind people who seemed genuinely pleased to have someone specifically tasked with caring for the boys' welfare beyond just their martial training. And then, as the bells tolled the second hour after noon, a page arrived with a message. Not just any page, but Adrian himself, sent by Prince Edmund with a note for Eleanor. The boy stood in her doorway, his amber eyes wide and filled with emotions too complex to name, and Eleanor felt time stop entirely. They stared at each other for a long moment, mother and son, separated by 3 years and 3 feet of stone floor and an ocean of unspoken words. Adrian looked so much older than the 6-year-old child Eleanor had last held in her arms. He was taller, his features more defined, his body showing the early signs of the powerful build he would develop as he matured. But his eyes were the same unique amber that mirrored Eleanor's own, and in those eyes she could see recognition and wonder and a desperate, fragile hope. "Mother?" Adrian whispered, his voice cracking on the word, and that single utterance broke whatever invisible barrier had been holding Eleanor in place. She crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and pulled her son into her arms, holding him with a fierceness born of 3 years of deprivation and longing. Adrian's arms came around her waist, clutching her with equal intensity, his face pressed against her shoulder, as his whole body began to shake with sobs that seemed torn from the very depths of his soul. "I thought you were dead," Adrian gasped between sobs. "They told me you died in the plague, that I was alone. But Prince Edmund said, he said you have been watching me, that you never left, that you came every day to see me, even when you could not speak to me. Is it true, Mother? Is it really true?" Eleanor was crying too hard to speak, could only nod against her son's auburn hair and hold him tighter, trying to communicate through touch what words could not express. They stood like that for several minutes, clinging to each other, crying out years of pain and separation and love that had endured despite everything that sought to destroy it. Finally, when the initial storm of emotion had passed, Eleanor pulled back just enough to look at Adrian's face, her hands coming up to cup his cheeks, her thumbs wiping away his tears, even as her own continued to fall. "It is true," she managed to say, her voice rough and broken. "Every word is true. I never stopped watching over you. never stopped loving you, never stopped being your mother even when we were apart. I am so sorry, Adrian. So sorry I could not be there, could not hold you and comfort you and tell you everything would be all right." Adrian shook his head fiercely. "You have nothing to apologize for, Mother. Prince Edmund explained everything, about Father's debts and the creditors who cheated you, about how you lost everything and were forced to leave the castle. He said you came every morning to watch me train, even in winter, even when you must have been cold and hungry and suffering. He said you never missed a day." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw you sometimes in the forest. I thought I was imagining things, but it was really you, was it not? That day I looked toward the trees and saw someone watching. That was you?" Eleanor nodded, remembering that moment with perfect clarity. "That was me. I was so afraid you would be frightened or confused, but I could not help myself. I needed to see you, to know you were safe and well. It was the only thing that kept me going through those terrible years." Adrian's hands gripped hers with surprising strength. "I am glad you came. Even before I knew it was you, I felt something, like someone was watching over me, keeping me safe. Now I know I was right. You were there, Mother. You never truly left me." They talked for hours, Eleanor explaining everything that had happened since the plague, Adrian sharing his own experiences of growing up in the castle, of his training and lessons, of the attack by the Scottish raiders and how terrified he had been. He told her about Prince Edmund's kindness, about how the prince had become like an older brother to him, offering guidance and protection and genuine affection. "He saved me in a way," Adrian said quietly. "After you were taken from me, after they told me you had died, I felt so alone. But the prince noticed me, took an interest in my training, talked to me about my father and what he had been like. He made me feel like I still had family, even when I thought I had none." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. "Then I owe Prince Edmund a debt I can never repay," she said softly. "He gave you what I could not during those years, a sense of belonging and connection. I will never forget that kindness." As the afternoon faded toward evening, Adrian reluctantly said he needed to return to his dormitory for the evening meal and his studies. But before he left, he hugged Eleanor one more time, holding on as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. "You will be here tomorrow?" he asked, a trace of old fear in his voice. "This is not a dream that will vanish when I wake?" Eleanor held him close, her lips pressed against his hair. "I will be here tomorrow and every day after. I am part of the castle household now. I am not going anywhere ever again, my darling boy. You are stuck with me." Adrian's laugh, young and joyful and free, was the most beautiful sound Eleanor had ever heard. He pulled back, a grin transforming his tear-stained face, and Eleanor saw in that expression a glimpse of the happy child he had been before tragedy had touched their lives. "Then I will see you tomorrow, Mother, at the formal introduction. I will pretend to be meeting you for the first time, like Prince Edmund suggested, at least in front of the other pages. But I will know the truth. I will always know the truth." After Adrian left, Eleanor stood at her window watching the sun set behind the castle walls, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, about all the pain and loss and desperate struggle that had preceded this day. She thought about William, about how proud he would be of the son they had created together, about how grateful he would be to know that Eleanor would now be able to watch over Adrian and guide him as he grew into manhood. And she thought about the future, about all the days that stretched ahead, days filled with the ordinary miracle of being near her son, of having conversations with him, of watching him continue to grow and learn and become the remarkable man she could already see taking shape within him. It would not always be easy, she knew. There would be challenges and complications, gossip and scrutiny, moments of difficulty and doubt. But they would face those challenges together, mother and son reunited, their bond proven stronger than any force that had sought to break it. That night, Eleanor knelt beside her new bed in her warm, comfortable chambers and offered up prayers of thanksgiving that came from the very depths of her soul. She had been given a miracle, a second chance, an opportunity to reclaim what had been stolen and to build a new life from the ruins of the old. And she vowed, with every fiber of her being, that she would never take that gift for granted, would never forget the years of hardship that had taught her the true value of every moment with her son. The next morning, Eleanor stood in the page's common room, dressed in one of her new gowns. as Master Edmund introduced her to the assembled boys. Adrian stood among them, his face carefully neutral as he listened to the weapons master explain that Mistress Eleanor Ashford would now be overseeing their daily needs and moral education. But when Master Edmund finished his introduction and Eleanor stepped forward to greet the boys, Adrian's eyes met hers, and in that shared glance was a world of love and understanding and joy. "I am honored to serve in this capacity," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear, addressing all the boys but speaking most truly to her son. "I will do my utmost to ensure your well-being and to help you develop not just as warriors, but as men of honor and integrity. My door is always open to you for any need or concern, no matter how small it may seem." The boys nodded respectfully, and the formal introduction concluded. As they filed out to begin their morning training, Adrian lingered for just a moment, and Eleanor saw him mouth two words that filled her heart to bursting. "Thank you." She nodded, understanding all that he meant by those simple words, all the gratitude and love and relief they contained. And so Eleanor Ashford began her new life, reunited with her son, restored to comfort and security, given a purpose and position that allowed her to use her skills in service of the boys who would become the next generation of knights. The road that had brought her to this place had been long and painful, marked by losses that had nearly broken her. But she had endured, had survived, had kept faith even when hope seemed impossible. As the months passed, Eleanor and Adrian navigated their relationship with care and wisdom, allowing it to deepen gradually in ways that felt natural rather than forced. The other pages came to respect and appreciate Eleanor's presence, finding in her a maternal figure who balanced kindness with appropriate discipline, who listened to their concerns and celebrated their achievements. Prince Edmund visited regularly, maintaining his role as mentor and friend to Adrian, treating Eleanor with the respect due her position and the genuine affection of someone who had come to value her character and strength. And sometimes, in quiet moments when the castle settled into evening stillness, Eleanor would stand at her window and look out toward the forest, where she had spent so many cold mornings watching her son from a distance. She no longer needed that vigil, no longer needed to hide in shadows to catch glimpses of Adrian's life. But she never forgot those years, never forgot the lessons they had taught her about love's endurance and the strength that can be found in even the most desperate circumstances. Eleanor had lost everything and had everything restored, not in the same form it had taken before, but in ways that were perhaps even more precious for having been fought for and reclaimed. She had her son. She had purpose and dignity. She had a future that stretched ahead with promise rather than despair. And she had learned with a certainty born of hard experience that love, true, unwavering, sacrificial love, could survive anything, could overcome any obstacle, could bridge any distance. That knowledge, that truth, was worth more than all the gold in the kingdom, and it would sustain her through whatever challenges the future might bring. As winter gave way to spring and the castle grounds bloomed with new life, Eleanor Ashford walked through her days with gratitude and joy, treasuring every moment with her son, every small victory in her work with the pages, every sunrise that brought the promise of another day in a life she had thought lost forever. She had endured the darkness and had emerged into light, and that journey, painful as it had been, had made her stronger, wiser, more compassionate than she ever could have become without it. And for that, despite everything, she found herself grateful.